In the year 356 before Christ, amidst a violent storm that lit up the skies over Pella, the capital of Macedonia, one of the most remarkable names in human history was born: Alexander, son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. From the moment of his conception, legends surrounded his figure. It is said that on the night he was conceived, his mother dreamed of a lightning bolt striking her womb, while Philip dreamed of sealing his wife's uterus with a lion's emblem. These symbolic accounts, seen through a modern lens, reflect not only the myths built around the birth of great figures, but also the royal attempt to legitimize Alexander's power as divinely predestined. At the time, Macedonia was not among the leading powers of Greece, but it was gaining strength and cohesion under the firm and cunning rule of Philip II, who was transforming a peripheral kingdom into a military force with pan-Hellenic ambitions. Alexander was therefore born at a time of transformation into a throne that had yet to project imperial power, but that was already expanding its influence over all of Hellas. Alexander's childhood was marked by a rare combination of rigorous military training and refined philosophical education. While other noble children were taught only how to fight, he was raised surrounded by seasoned generals, but also by tutors who instilled in him the virtues of courage, discipline, and reason. His mother, Olympias, was a deeply religious woman, devoted to Orphic cults and Dionysian mysteries, and she instilled in Alexander the idea that he was the son of Zeus. This belief was more than symbolic. It shaped his personality and planted in his spirit the conviction that his destiny was grand, that his existence was an extension of the divine on earth. His father, Philip, who viewed war as a science and politics as a game of power, saw in Alexander not just an heir, but the key instrument to continue his expansionist project. The result of this combination was a deeply intelligent young prince, a strategist from childhood, with a sense of mission that went far beyond the mere desire to rule. Macedonia at that time was a land of contrasts. Located north of mainland Greece, it was viewed with suspicion by Athenians and Spartans, who considered themselves more civilized. Macedonians were seen as rough, with customs regarded as barbaric by their southern neighbors, even though they spoke a Greek dialect and shared many cultural traits. This tension between being Greek and being peripheral marked the early trajectory of Alexander, who grew up with a desire to prove that his nation not only belonged to the Hellenic world, but was destined to lead it. This longing for cultural and political recognition would be key to understanding his campaign to unify Greece and his later attempt to merge East and West. Alexander's youth unfolded in an environment of preparation for something greater. The Macedonian court was both a school of war and a laboratory of power. From a very young age, Alexander displayed exceptional abilities. At just 12 years old, he tamed the horse Bucephalus, whom no one else could mount, simply by realizing the animal was frightened by its own shadow. This scene, often repeated in biographies and works of art, symbolizes his ability to perceive the invisible, to master what others fear, and to act with calculated boldness. This moment was essential not only for gaining his father's respect, but also for solidifying his public image as someone endowed with superior intelligence and control over brute forces. Bucephalus would be his companion through nearly all of his future military campaigns, and his death years later would mark a moment of deep mourning for Alexander. Thus, his childhood and adolescence already outlined an epic prelude to something much greater, a boy forged in war, guided by gods, taught by sages, and destined to cross the world with a sword in one hand and a book in the other. This almost mythical construction of young Alexander would be completed with the arrival of Aristotle, his tutor and intellectual mentor. Philip hired the most prominent philosopher of his generation to educate the heir, bringing Alexander to Mysa, where he would study philosophy, ethics, politics, medicine, and natural sciences. More than a philosopher, Aristotle was a shaper of minds, planting in the young prince the ideals of the golden mean, rational logic, and self-control. Alexander was profoundly influenced by this thinking. He carried works like the Iliad with him, annotated with personal notes, and saw in the tales of Achilles a mirror of his own life. The presence of Aristotle marked the fusion between intellectual formation and battlefield pragmatism, turning Alexander into a figure who could both calculate tactical formations and discuss the causes of the movement of celestial bodies. By adolescence, Alexander was already admired and feared at court. He took part in his father's campaigns, commanded military units, and was sent on diplomatic missions. He was not merely a crown prince, he was a prince in action. His personality was intense, proud, often impetuous, yet tempered by unshakable discipline and rare intelligence. As the throne neared, the winds of history seemed to blow all in one direction. A young man trained as both warrior and philosopher, son of an ambitious king and a mystical queen, born in a land thirsty for greatness and prepared to redraw the boundaries of the known world. Before Alexander could raise his sword against the world, it was his father, Philip II, who shaped the stage upon which he would rise. Often overshadowed by the brilliance of his son, Philip was, in truth, the true architect of the Macedonian war machine. When he took the throne in 359 before Christ, Macedonia was fragmented, threatened by barbarian invasions, and plagued by an unruly nobility. It was neither a power nor a stable kingdom, but Philip, who had spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, one of the most militarized city-states in Greece, absorbed invaluable lessons in warfare, discipline, and diplomacy. He returned to the north determined to transform his homeland into something entirely new, and he succeeded. Philip's first major innovation was the reform of the army. He reorganized the infantry into deep phalanxes armed with long spears known as sarissas, creating formations that were nearly impenetrable and highly coordinated. For him, war was a calculation, an engineering of moving bodies. Beyond military reforms, Philip was a master of politics. He used marriages as strategic alliances, joining with women from various kingdoms and tribes to secure loyalty, gain access to trade routes, and strengthen borders. Alexander's own mother, Olympias, came from Epirus, and her marriage to Philip was not just for passion, it was part of a geopolitical chessboard. Philip also knew when to attack and when to corrupt. Rather than fight prolonged battles with all the Greek cities, he preferred diplomacy, bribery and espionage to divide opponents, weaken resistance, and expand his influence without excessive bloodshed. His ultimate goal was not just to control Macedonia, but to become the supreme commander of all Greece, something he achieved years later by leading the Corinthian League, a confederation under his hegemony that unified the city-states, except for Sparta. It was the first step toward a far greater dream, the conquest of the Persian Empire. As he expanded his political and military influence, Philip kept a meticulous eye on the education of his heir. He didn't want just a successor, but someone capable of continuing the expansionist project he himself would not be able to finish. Alexander, still a teenager, was sent on campaigns to observe and lead as an extension of his father's will. Their relationship was ambiguous, filled with mutual admiration, but also restrained rivalry. Alexander grew with his own brilliance, and Philip, though proud, feared being eclipsed too soon. Palace intrigues began to emerge when Philip took new wives and fathered other children, sparking speculation about succession. Olympias, fiercely protective, feared Alexander would be cast aside, and the political atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Amid external victories, Philip saw his own household becoming a minefield of distrust, wounded pride, and silent conspiracies. Philip's consecration as pan-Hellenic leader came after the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 before Christ, when his troops crushed the resistance of the Greek city-states, including a coalition between Athens and Thebes. In that battle, Alexander, just 18 years old, successfully led one of the army's flanks, demonstrating for the first time his real capacity to command. The victory secured control over Greece, but the king was not satisfied. His eyes were set to the east, toward the Persian Empire, whose wealth, mythology, and glory had fascinated the Greeks for centuries. Philip dreamed of avenging past Persian attacks against Greece and conquering Asia as a historic response. He then organized a campaign, raised troops, and laid out plans to cross the Hellespont and begin his march. But death struck before he could take the first step. In 336 before Christ, during the wedding of his daughter in Pella, Philip was assassinated by one of his bodyguards, Pausanias. The motive for the crime remains shrouded in mystery, though many historians speculate about a web of personal revenge, political betrayal, and internal conspiracies. Some believe Olympias may have plotted against him. Others see in Alexander a silent shadow of interest, though no definitive proof has survived. The fact is, With Philip's death, the throne passed to Alexander, who at that time was only 20 years old. The transition of power was swift, brutal, and efficient. Potential rivals were executed, and Alexander established himself as the sole legitimate heir. There was no room for hesitation. The young king had learned from his father that to maintain power one must wield precision, control, and resolve. And so, with a sharpened blade, he inherited not just a throne, but an ongoing geopolitical project. Though dead, Philip remained ever present in the structure he left behind for his son. His army was modern, disciplined, and loyal. Macedonia was unified, the Greek cities were under control, and the plans to invade Persia were already outlined. Few fathers have ever left so much in the hands of a son. Alexander would not need to start a project. He merely had to continue walking a path already carved with effort, blood, and brilliance. Philip's shadow was long, but Alexander would not be content to walk beneath it. He would surpass it and in time eclipse his very creator. Yet without Philip II, there would never have been an Alexander the Great. Among all the weapons Alexander would inherit to conquer the world, perhaps the most powerful was not forged in iron, but in thought. When Philip II hired Aristotle to be his son's tutor, he did not merely choose a renowned philosopher, he chose the greatest living thinker of his time, direct heir to Plato's tradition and mentor of ideas that would shape science, logic, politics, and ethics for centuries. Alexander was about 13 years old when he began studying under Aristotle, and it did not happen amidst the noise of palace corridors. He was taken to Mieza, a quiet and leafy city where, according to ancient records, Aristotle taught his disciples in shaded gardens, walking with them while discussing philosophy and science. This formative experience was a turning point. Alexander would not be just a warrior, but a man shaped by reason, intellectual curiosity, and the search for order in chaos. The education Alexander received was not merely theoretical. Aristotle believed that a ruler should understand the world in order to transform it, not just conquer it. For that reason, he taught the young prince anatomy, geography, zoology, rhetoric, medicine, ethics, and logic. Alexander learned to observe nature, to question patterns, to explore causal reasoning. He was not merely taught reading and arithmetic. He was trained to think critically, to find meaning in the movements of the sky, in the cycles of the seasons, in the impulses of crowds. More than anything, he learned to value knowledge as a tool of governance and control. The fascination he would later show for foreign cultures, his ability to absorb and reorganize political and religious systems, and even his interest in cartography and botany during his military campaigns, were born from the solid foundation laid in Mieza, under the guidance of the man many consider the father of Western science. But the relationship between master and student was not free of tension. Aristotle was a man of logos, of reason, while Alexander increasingly saw himself as a son of destiny, guided by divine signs. Classical Greek logic, which defended the limitation of power and the supremacy of reason over will, clashed with the young king's growing ambition. Still, for years, Alexander maintained deep respect for his teacher. He carried with him an annotated copy of the Iliad, a gift from Aristotle himself, and guarded it as if it were a sacred text. The figure of Achilles, the quintessential Greek hero, served as his mirror and model, a warrior of superhuman strength, driven by glory and the quest for immortality through great deeds. Aristotle, by shaping Alexander's mind, planted in him the seed of immortality, not through deification, but through permanence in time via action, culture, and knowledge. It is impossible to understand Alexander's political strategies and adult decisions without considering Aristotle's influence. The way he governed conquered cities, respecting local customs and encouraging cultural fusion, was not just a convenient tactic. It reflected a philosophical ideal of rational unity in the world. When founding new cities, many of them named Alexandria, Alexander was not only establishing military posts, but intellectual hubs, libraries, schools, and observatories. Alexandria in Egypt, later home to the greatest library of the ancient world, was conceived in this spirit, a convergence point of cultures where knowledge would be more valuable than gold. This impulse was not natural to every conqueror. It was the direct fruit of a mind trained to see the world as something to be understood, systematized, and then governed. However, as Alexander grew in power and self-confidence, his admiration for Aristotle began to cool. The need to assert himself as a semi-divine figure, the desire to be revered as a hero and not merely a king, and his deepening immersion into Eastern cultures created an ideological rift between teacher and student. Aristotle, a staunch defender of Greek superiority, looked with suspicion upon Alexander's adoption of Persian dress, mixed marriages, and reverence for foreign deities. Alexander, in turn, began to see Greek thought as a limitation to his universalist vision. What began as a learning relationship gradually turned into a subtle yet inevitable distancing. Still, the philosopher's legacy persisted in how Alexander structured his decisions, analyzed his enemies, and conducted his empire. Even when diverging from his master, he continued to act like someone shaped by him. Beyond ethical and intellectual formation, living with Aristotle also instilled in Alexander a deep respect for empirical observation. During his campaigns, it was not uncommon for him to collect exotic species, describe natural phenomena, and commission geographic reports of unknown regions. This scientific curiosity was unusual for a general, but made perfect sense for someone trained not only to conquer lands, but to understand them in their essence. The fusion of sword and science, of war and wisdom, became one of Alexander's most unique traits. He saw himself as an instrument of global transformation, and knowledge was the primary gear of that transformation. Even if Aristotle was not present in the trenches or the power halls of Asia, his thinking walked beside Alexander like a permanent intellectual shadow. By the end of his life, Alexander may have become distanced from his teacher, perhaps even in hostile terms, but the bond between the two had already served its purpose. The mind of the greatest conqueror of antiquity had been shaped by one of the greatest thinkers in history, and the world, which would later become Hellenistic, would be a projection of this improbable fusion between sword and logic, between conquest and philosophy. The empire Alexander built had many pillars, but the Aristotelian pillar of reason was among the deepest. Long before Alexander crossed the Hellespont or faced Darius III on the fields of Asia, he was already accustomed to the sound of armor, the metallic scent of blood, and the silent tension of war strategy. As a teenager, Alexander was summoned by his father, Philip II, to join military campaigns and war councils, not as a mere observer, but as an active commander of troops. From an early age, he was treated as a prince in training, with real responsibilities, both on the battlefield and in the administration of power. At just 16 years old, during his father's absence on a campaign in Thrace, Alexander was left as regent of Macedonia. In that short time, he not only maintained order in the kingdom, but also crushed a tribal rebellion and founded a city, Alexandropolis, naming it after himself, a gesture that would later repeat across the lands he conquered. His first great trial by fire came 2 years later, at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 before Christ. At only 18, Alexander commanded the left wing of the Macedonian army alongside his father's seasoned veterans, and faced the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, two of the most powerful city-states in Greece. The clash was brutal. Despite their discipline and experience, the Athenian and Theban troops were unprepared for the new tactical model developed by Philip, a deep infantry phalanx armed with sarissas, supported by mobile cavalry and flanking maneuvers. Even at his young age, Alexander demonstrated an almost supernatural instinct for reading terrain, timing, and breaking enemy formations. It was he who led the decisive charge against the Theban Sacred Band, an elite unit considered invincible until that moment. The destruction of this group not only sealed the Macedonian victory, but also elevated the young prince to the status of national and even mythological hero in the eyes of many. This victory solidified Philip's dominance over Greece, but also projected Alexander as a military figure in his own right. He was no longer merely the king's son, he was a battlefield-proven commander, admired by the troops. The Macedonian army, notoriously skeptical of noble youth, began to see him with genuine respect. This bond between Alexander and his soldiers would prove crucial in the years to come, as they crossed continents together, enduring deserts, mountains, and unimaginable enemies. The trust forged in those early battles, the perception that the young prince did not lead from afar, but from the front lines, risking his life beside common soldiers, became the cement of a loyalty that would withstand mutinies, exhaustion, and doubt over the decade-long campaign that followed. Yet war was not the only arena in which Alexander excelled. His active participation in court politics revealed his skill in diplomacy, alliance building, and internal power navigation. He knew when to stay silent, when to confront, when to flatter, and when to be ruthless. He understood the nature of the Macedonian nobility, proud, ambitious, and fragmented, and gradually positioned himself as indispensable. Philip II, aware of his son's growing popularity and self-confidence, began to exclude Alexander from certain strategic decisions. Tension grew behind the scenes, especially after Philip married a young Macedonian noblewoman, Eurydice, raising doubts about succession and Alexander's legitimacy as heir. Olympias, Alexander's mother, left the court in protest. Alexander himself withdrew for a time, and rumors spread of a possible irreparable rupture. However, before that tension turned into open conflict, Philip was assassinated. The sudden death of the king in 336 before Christ completely altered Alexander's fate. At just 20 years old, he was proclaimed king, but his throne was far from secure. Several generals, nobles, and tribes still loyal to the old regime viewed such a young king with suspicion. Some saw him only as a bold warrior with no political experience. Others suspected he might be a mere puppet of the Queen Mother or hidden interests. Aware of the danger, Alexander acted with cold precision. He executed potential rivals, neutralized rebels, and reaffirmed his authority through brutal displays of power. In doing so, he quickly consolidated control over Macedonia and turned his eyes toward Greece, where some cities considered rebelling after Philip's death. Alexander marched swiftly to Thebes with overwhelming force, destroyed the city after brief resistance, and sold thousands of its citizens into slavery. It was a clear message. The king was young, but he would not be challenged. These early years of war and power revealed far more than military prowess. They unveiled a surgical mind that understood war as a political tool, fear as a means of control, and prestige as strategic capital. Alexander did not hesitate. Where others faltered, he struck. Where there was doubt, he imposed action. This impetuousness, tempered by refined intelligence and a unique philosophical upbringing, forged an almost unrepeatable profile. A young man who could lead armies, dominate assemblies, and inspire legend. Though his greatest deeds still lay ahead, the Alexander who would conquer the world was already formed. Those early years had proven not only that he could win, but that he was born never to be confined by borders. The death of Philip II in 336 before Christ triggered a chain of events that could have plunged Macedonia into civil war, tribal division, and dynastic chaos. But that didn't happen, because the son who inherited the throne was not just a prince. He was a tested warrior, a victorious commander, a name already feared by his father's own generals. Alexander assumed the throne at the age of 20, an age when many are still seeking guidance. But he acted as if he already knew the weight of the crown. His first move was to guarantee the legitimacy of his reign, which required eliminating any doubt about the line of succession. Alexander ordered the execution of cousins, half-brothers, and generals who showed parallel ambitions. Many of these men had served under Philip for decades, but none were spared if they displayed hesitation or independence. It was an act of absolute power, not only to secure the throne, but to show that the new king would not be manipulated or tested. This brutal process of political purification also served to redefine the relationship between the throne and the Macedonian nobility. Unlike the Greek cities with democratic traditions, Macedonia was an aristocratic monarchy where the king constantly had to balance authority with the loyalty of warrior families. Alexander knew he could not rule by fear alone, so he rewarded his most loyal allies with key positions, command of troops, and regional autonomy, on the condition of absolute loyalty. At the same time, he launched a propaganda campaign focused on continuity. He presented himself not only as the heir of Philip, but as the carrier of the pan-Hellenic mission to bring Greek civilization to Asia. He convened assemblies, renewed alliances, and reaffirmed treaties with Greek cities in the name of the same vision that Philip had initiated. His youth, which might have been seen as a weakness, was transformed into a symbol of vigor, renewal, and visionary leadership. However, internal Macedonian stability was only half the problem. Shortly after Philip's death, Rumors about his succession spread through the Greek cities, and a wave of rebellious euphoria began to take shape. Thebes and Athens, still resentful of Macedonian dominance, started mobilizing troops, believing the new king lacked the strength or skill to maintain pressure. It was a bold gamble, and Alexander responded with terrifying speed. He marched his armies south, crossing territories at forced pace, surprising enemy spies, and reaching the gates of Greece before the cities were ready to resist. Thebes, which had led the uprising, was surrounded and almost completely destroyed. Houses were burned, citizens sold into slavery, and the few survivors scattered. This action had an immediate effect. The other cities retreated, realizing the young king was no ceremonial figure. He was a real warrior, with fury and purpose. With the Greek rebellion contained, Alexander turned his eyes once more to the north of Macedonia, where barbarian tribes still threatened the borders. He led rapid campaigns against the Thracians, Triballi and Illyrians, who had tested central power with minor attacks during the government transition. Instead of negotiating or merely containing the leaders, Alexander imposed total domination. He destroyed fortresses, hunted clans in the mountains, and demanded noble hostages to guarantee the submission of the tribes. These campaigns, though less well known, were crucial in ensuring that Macedonia's rear was secure. The brutal efficiency of these actions reinforced the idea that there was no room for hesitation or concession in the new reign. Alexander was preparing the board with surgical precision, eliminating internal divisions, commanding respect from traditional enemies, and strengthening a collective identity based on strength, glory, and inevitable expansion. With Macedonia unified and Greece subdued, Alexander then turned his attention to the project his father had left unfinished: war against the Persian Empire. The pretext remained the same: revenge for the Persian invasions during the Greco-Persian Wars, the liberation of Greek cities in Asia Minor, the expansion of Hellenic culture. But for Alexander, the war meant something much greater. It was a chance to become not only king of Macedonia, but lord of the world. His ambition was more than territorial. It was spiritual, civilizational, almost mystical. He didn't merely want to conquer. He wanted to remake the world in his own image, to unite East and West under a new imperial logic. But before that, he had to plan. And like a methodical general, Alexander spent months organizing troops, calculating routes, studying supplies, and carefully choosing the men who would accompany him. The army he would lead to Asia was small compared to Persian numbers, but it was the most disciplined, experienced, and loyal of its era. A force forged to win, with a leader prepared to make history. And so, with Macedonia pacified, with his enemies either dead or kneeling, with Greece bowed to his authority, Alexander prepared for the march. The most important moment of his life was about to begin. The crossing of the Hellespont would not just be a military maneuver, it would be a symbolic gesture, a transition between worlds, between eras, between myths and reality. The young king was ready. His people followed him. His mind was armed with philosophy, his body trained for combat, and his name was already echoing like a prophecy among the peoples of Asia. The conquest was about to begin. The death of Philip II was more than a change in command. For many in the Greek city-states, it was interpreted as a sign of weakness, a providential opening to break free from Macedonian rule. Among all the cities, it was Thebes that moved first. Proud, traditionally a rival of Athens and Sparta, and the protagonist of military victories in the previous generation, Thebes believed it could reverse the domination imposed by Philip. The absence of Philip and the youth of Alexander fueled hopes that Macedonian hegemony would be short-lived. Led by an elite that saw the moment as an opportunity to regain lost prestige, the Thebans expelled the Macedonian garrison stationed within the city, declared independence, and prepared to resist. They expected support from Athens, perhaps even from Sparta, and believed the new king of Macedonia would hesitate before facing a coalition. But what they received was something entirely different: a swift, lethal, and unforgettable response. Alexander didn't just act. He struck Greece like a bolt of lightning. He marched south with his army at a speed that shocked both allies and enemies. When he arrived at the walls of Thebes, many still believed there would be negotiations or a long siege. But Alexander knew exactly what message he wanted to send: that no city, no matter how historic or powerful, could challenge his rule with impunity. When the Thebans refused to surrender, the siege became a massacre. The Macedonian troops, aided by Greek allies who wanted to prevent the rebellion from spreading, stormed the city with devastating force. It is estimated that over 6,000 Thebans were killed in combat, or in the days that followed. Nearly 30,000 were captured and sold into slavery. Homes were looted, temples desecrated, walls torn down. And as a final blow, Alexander ordered that Thebes be erased from the map. The city was demolished, and its territory divided among Macedonian allies. The destruction of Thebes was not mere revenge, it was a manifesto. Alexander wanted to leave a deep psychological mark on the remaining city-states, and he succeeded. In Athens, which had also flirted with rebellion, the impact was immediate. Pro-rebellion leaders fell silent. Assemblies backed down, and ambassadors were quickly sent to Alexander to swear loyalty and offer support. Sparta, ever proud and aloof, remained neutral. No other city dared rise against him at that moment. The terror caused by the destruction of Thebes consolidated Alexander as the true master of Greece, not only through military force, but through absolute control over the political will of the polis. Fear had replaced doubt, and where there is absolute fear, there is no room for resistance. However, beyond politics, the episode of Thebes reveals something deeper about Alexander's personality. Despite being shaped by Aristotelian ethics, which emphasized balance and reason, he showed a readiness for extreme actions when his authority was challenged. The city's destruction was total, and many contemporaries saw it as a display of cruelty. Others interpreted it as a tactical necessity, a price to be paid to avoid prolonged wars and a chain of rebellions. Alexander did not back down. He justified the massacre as an exemplary punishment, and records indicate he showed no regret. On the contrary, after the event he made a point of highlighting his magnanimity by sparing the descendants of the poet Pindar, a cultural symbol of Thebes. It was a subtle way to communicate that his fury was selective, political, deliberate, not a mere outburst of destruction. The impact of Thebes' destruction was not limited to Greece. It reached the ears of Persian King Darius III, who until then had watched Macedonian movements with distance and mild condescension. The news that a young king had destroyed one of the most important cities of Hellas without hesitation changed the tone of Persian analyses. Darius began to view Alexander as a real adversary, not just another local ruler. The Asian world began to perceive that something new was rising in the West, a conqueror with unlimited ambition, with method, and with a thirst for glory. The eyes of the East turned toward the new king, and Alexander for his part used the memory of what he had done in Thebes as a diplomatic weapon. Before crossing the Hellespont, he demanded that the Greek cities of Asia Minor receive him not as an invader, but as a liberator, and they all knew the alternative to submission wasn't negotiation, it was the same fate as Thebes. Thebes thus became more than a destroyed city. It became a symbol, a warning, a cornerstone of Alexander's empire. The echo of its ruins sustained the obedient silence of neighboring cities, and in the conqueror's biography, it marked the point of no return. From that moment on, Alexander was no longer just a successor seeking to preserve what his father built. He was the architect of something new, an empire that began in ashes and would march into the unknown. With Greece subdued, the northern tribes pacified, and his authority consolidated through blood, fear, and strategy. Alexander turned to the grand project initiated by his father, Philip II, the invasion of the Persian Empire. But for the new king, this campaign was far more than a continuation. It was a life mission, a personal epic, a civilizational ambition. The Persian Empire at the time was the largest and wealthiest in the world. It stretched from Asia Minor to the far reaches of India, crossing deserts, rivers, mountains, and thousands of cities. To cross that vast domain was not merely a military challenge, it bordered on madness, and yet, for Alexander, it was inevitable. His spirit was not made for limits. He wanted to be remembered as greater than the heroes of the Iliad, greater than the kings of Persia, greater than any man. To achieve that, he would need to conquer the known world, and it would begin with the symbolic and historical crossing of the Hellespont, the strait that separated Europe from Asia. Before marching, Alexander meticulously prepared both the body and soul of his army. He assembled approximately 37,000 soldiers, including veteran Macedonians, Greek allies, and mercenaries. Though numerically inferior to the forces the Persians could muster, this army was highly disciplined, trained for years under Philip's military reforms, and hardened in recent wars. The elite infantry, the hypaspists, would guard the flanks of the phalanx, armed with sarissas over 5 meters long. The cavalry, especially the companion unit, the hetairoi, would be commanded by Alexander himself, executing rapid and precise shock maneuvers. Additionally, there were archers, spearmen, engineers, and a naval fleet of 160 triremes. Alexander understood that war would not be decided solely on the battlefield. It would require supplies, routes, logistics, constant resupply, and communication across hostile regions. Every detail was drawn with care before the first step was taken. Spiritual preparation was also essential. Alexander needed his men to believe they were fighting for something greater than gold or land. He revived the ancestral narrative that the Persians were historic enemies of Greece, the same who had burned Athens during the Greco-Persian Wars, the same who were held back by Leonidas at Thermopylae and defeated by Themistocles at Salamis. Alexander fused these memories with the idea of historical revenge and the liberation of Greek cities in Asia Minor, still under Persian control. At the same time, he added a new element. He presented himself as the hero destined to unite the world under a single order. The war against Persia was to him a civilizational and almost religious act. This rhetoric unified the troops, justified the sacrifice, and elevated his image to something beyond human. His soldiers were not merely following a king, they were following an ideal. Before crossing the Hellespont, Alexander performed a highly symbolic ceremony. From his ship, he hurled a spear into Asian soil, declaring he entered that land as a conqueror. Then he visited the legendary site of Troy, where, according to Homeric tradition, Achilles had fought and died. Alexander honored the hero's tomb with offerings and wreaths. It was more than ritual. It was the fusion of myth and reality. He saw himself as a spiritual descendant of Achilles, and there on the windswept Asian coast, he sealed a silent pact with the gods and with destiny. He would surpass legend. The gesture also held political value. By associating himself with the Iliad, Alexander spoke directly to the Greek collective imagination, linking his journey to verses everyone had known since childhood. It was as if he were saying, "This is not just a campaign, it is a new epic." With that, Alexander began the long march across Asia, and the Persian Empire began to feel his presence like a whisper that would become a roar. Initially, the Persian satrap of Phrygia attempted to contain the Macedonian advance with small forces, betting it was a regional movement, but the march was steady, calculated, and relentless. Alexander advanced not only with force but with strategy. He respected cities that surrendered, imposed discipline to avoid looting, and offered protection to local populations in exchange for cooperation. He understood that war was not won solely by victories, but by creating an image of inevitability. He wanted to be seen as a storm that could not be stopped, but that could be embraced. To do that, he needed to win hearts before breaching walls. The preparations, therefore, were not only military, they were also symbolic, moral, and cultural. Alexander surrounded himself with historians, cartographers, interpreters, and scientists. His campaign was also a mission of knowledge. He recorded rivers, studied customs, catalogued territories. It was as if each step of his march redrew the map of the world itself. Unsurprisingly, many modern scholars consider him not just a conqueror, but the first agent of ancient globalization. He carried not only spears, but ideas exchange and territorial reorganization, and this was already visible in the opening stages of the campaign, when Greek cities in Asia Minor received him as a liberator, rather than an invader. For the first time, Asian soil welcomed a European army with an ambition to remain. Alexander did not want to simply cross, he wanted to rule. The campaign against Persia was officially underway. The world was watching. The throne of Darius III, still distant, began to tremble under rumors of advance and victory, and Alexander, with a mind sharpened by Aristotle, a heart inflamed by Achilles, and a sword forged through war, was preparing for his first major test, the Battle of the Granicus. But for him, this was only the beginning. The crossing of the Hellespont in 334 before Christ was not merely a tactical maneuver. It was a gesture filled with symbolism. representing Alexander's definitive entrance into the Asian stage. By crossing the strait that separated Europe from Asia, the young king was not only transferring his army to a new continent, but also breaking symbolically with the boundaries of the traditional Greek world. On the Asian coast, Alexander made a point of visiting Troy, where he honored the Homeric heroes with funeral rituals. He placed wreaths on the tombs of Achilles and Patroclus, and offered tributes before the gods who had protected the ancient warriors. This carefully planned ceremony was intended not only to show reverence for the myths, but also to legitimize his own mission as the spiritual heir of Greek glory. It was as if he was silently declaring that his campaign was not an ordinary war, but a continuation of the epic begun centuries earlier by mythical heroes. After these rituals, Alexander turned his attention to the first real battlefield threat: the Persian satraps of Asia Minor, who had gathered their forces near the Granicus River in present-day Turkey. The Persian forces, though numerous, were poorly coordinated, composed of noble cavalry and Greek mercenary contingents hired to protect the region. They hoped to stop Alexander immediately before he could move inland, but the Macedonian king did not hesitate. Despite unfavorable geography, he would have to cross a river in a disadvantaged position. He decided to attack immediately in a maneuver that surprised both allies and enemies. His decision to attack at dusk, crossing turbulent waters, exemplified Alexander's style, bold, calculated, and driven by a confidence bordering on divine instinct. The battle was violent and swift. Alexander personally led the elite cavalry, attacking the center of the Persian formation, where the nobles were concentrated. The hand-to-hand combat was brutal. According to ancient sources, Alexander was struck in the head by a Persian sword, but was saved by one of his generals, Clytus, who killed the attacker with a spear. The image of the young king bleeding but continuing to lead left a lasting impression on the troops and reinforced his image as a predestined warrior. While the Macedonian cavalry broke the enemy lines, the infantry crossed the river and completed the encirclement. Persian resistance collapsed, and the field was covered in corpses. Many local commanders were killed, and the Greek mercenaries were captured. Alexander ordered that about 2,000 of them be sent back to Greece in chains, as proof of his victory, and a warning to any city still considering rebellion. The victory at Granicus was decisive for several reasons. First, it opened the path to the conquest of all of Asia Minor, as the local satraps had been defeated and resistance scattered. Cities like Sardis, Miletus, and Halicarnassus, which had previously served the Persian Empire, began to surrender or offer voluntary support. Alexander treated cities that surrendered without resistance with relative generosity, guaranteeing their institutions and religious freedom, which bolstered his reputation as a just and liberating leader. Second, the victory solidified troop morale, as the soldiers now saw Alexander not just as a king but as an invincible commander. The bond of trust between leader and army would become one of the pillars of the Asian campaign. Third, news of the defeat reached Darius III, who until then had viewed Alexander as a distant threat. The reality of a loss on Persian soil changed the tone of the royal court and initiated preparations for direct confrontation. Beyond the immediate effects, the Battle of Granicus also served as the first proof of the Macedonian phalanx's efficiency on Asian ground. The tactics of Philip II, refined by Alexander, proved superior to the Persian model of noble cavalry and mercenary infantry. The cohesion, discipline, and maneuverability of the Macedonian army compensated for their numerical disadvantage. As Alexander demonstrated, wars were not won with numbers, but with strategy, leadership, and courage. He placed himself on the front lines, fought in the bloodiest clashes, and was seen by his men as someone willing to die beside them. This posture forged a bond of almost religious loyalty. The soldiers fought not just for victory, they fought for Alexander. With Granicus won, Alexander occupied the Persian fortresses of Lydia and began reorganizing the conquered cities. He appointed local governors, blending Macedonian leaders with native elites, and established permanent garrisons. He did not destroy, he integrated. He did not humiliate, he co-opted. This policy of cultural adaptation and absorption would become one of the hallmarks of his empire. He did not seek to erase what he conquered, but to transform the territory into an extension of his ideal. Gradually, the landscape of Asia Minor began to change. Monuments to Alexander were erected, Coins bearing his name began to circulate, and temples honored him as a liberator. It was the beginning of a civilizational transition. The king did not want to be remembered only as a conqueror. He wanted to be immortalized as a symbol of cultural fusion, a bridge between the Greek world and the kingdoms of the East. The victory at Granicus was therefore much more than a one battle. It was the inaugural act of a new era, a prelude to the storm advancing toward the heart of Persia. A reminder that Alexander would not be merely a footnote in the wars of the ancient world, but its central figure, and he was just beginning. The Battle of Issus, fought in 333 before Christ, was the first major direct clash between Alexander the Great and Persian king Darius III. Unlike the Battle of Granicus, where Alexander faced regional satraps, the confrontation at Issus brought face to face the two greatest military powers of the known world. Aware of the growing threat, Darius assembled a colossal army, with some ancient sources estimating up to 600,000 men. Though modern historians consider the number significantly lower, yet still vastly superior to the Macedonian force in sheer size. Symbolically, it was the entire Persian Empire turning its fury against a single man and his relatively small army. But Alexander had learned that victory in war rarely belongs to the largest force, and almost always to the best prepared. The region of Issus in southern Anatolia between the mountains and the Mediterranean Sea constrained troop movements and rendered the Persian numerical advantage useless. Alexander, a master of terrain, exploited this brilliantly. Upon realizing that Darius had positioned himself behind him, cutting off his supply line, Alexander did not panic or retreat. Instead, he swiftly reorganized his army and forced a march back through difficult terrain, catching the enemy by surprise. This quick and dangerous decision highlighted Alexander's absolute confidence in his logistics, his troops, and his ability to read the battlefield. By positioning himself near the Pinarus River, he created ideal conditions for confronting a larger army, a narrow battlefield that would prevent the Persians from fully deploying their numbers and favor Macedonian combat style, based on a cohesive phalanx and precise cavalry maneuvers. On the battlefield, Darius III took position at the center, protected by his royal guard and surrounded by heavy infantry. On the flanks, his cavalry aimed to break through the Macedonian lines. Alexander, as usual, commanded the right wing and positioned the phalanx at the center with impeccable discipline. The battle began with the advance of the Macedonian cavalry and the movement of the Hypaspists, elite infantry, against the Persian flank. The goal was not merely to break the lines, but to open a corridor toward Darius himself. Seeing a gap in the enemy formation, Alexander personally led the charge against the Persian center. The impact was devastating. Darius, witnessing the collapse of his royal guard and facing imminent capture, fled the battlefield in a chariot, causing panic among his troops. The Persian king's retreat had an immediate psychological effect. It disorganized the army and shattered their morale. With Darius's flight, the battle turned into a massacre. The Persians, now leaderless, were pursued and slaughtered for miles. The Macedonians captured the royal baggage, including Darius's mother, wife, and daughters, who had been camped nearby. In a gesture that surprised many, Alexander treated the royal women with honor and respect. He preserved their dignity, ensured their safety, and housed them in royal accommodations. This behavior was publicized as a sign of nobility and self-control, contributing to Alexander's image as a civilized king, distinct from ordinary looters. It was a dual strategy, demonstrating his dominance not only over the enemy, but over himself. Alexander wanted to be seen as the rightful heir to the Persian throne, not merely a foreign conqueror. The victory at Issus had enormous repercussions. Militarily, it destroyed Persian momentum and gave Alexander complete control over Asia Minor. Cities and regions previously loyal to Darius began surrendering in sequence. Symbolically, it solidified the myth of Alexander as invincible, defeating the great king in open battle, forcing him to flee, and capturing his family without suffering strategic losses was a feat few leaders in history could replicate. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, which had hesitated between submission and resistance, began opening their gates without a fight. Alexander was consolidating not only military power, but also political authority and universal prestige. The war against Persia was no longer about vengeance. It was becoming an imperial transition, The young Macedonian king was starting to be seen as the legitimate ruler of the East. For Darius, the defeat at Issus was more than military, it was personal devastation. For the first time, the King of Kings had fled a battlefield, abandoning even his family. This deeply eroded his image among Persian nobles, many of whom began to question his leadership. The Persian throne, once unquestionable, now trembled under the weight of shame and insecurity. Sensing this fragility, Alexander did not pause his advance. He rejected Darius's peace offers, which proposed territorial concessions and the return of his family. Alexander replied that he would accept nothing less than total surrender, and that from that moment forward, Darius was no longer the legitimate king of Asia. This radical stance, both insolent and strategically brilliant, declared to the world that the Persian Empire was now merely a shadow of its former self, and that a new sovereign was taking its place. The tactical genius demonstrated at Issus cemented Alexander as the supreme commander of his time. He had faced a numerically superior army in a distant region against the mightiest empire on earth, and emerged not only victorious, but glorified. His campaign now took on a new dimension. It was no longer merely military or political, it was civilizational. The East had been wounded at its core, and the West had gained a new profit of conquest. And in the fields of Issus, bathed in blood and glory, the true fall of the Persian Empire had begun. Alexander's campaign against the Persian Empire, after the crushing victory at Issus, gained strength and scale with unprecedented speed. Cities fell, entire regions were absorbed, and Alexander's name spread like an unstoppable wind. But there was one obstacle that could not be overcome by the speed of cavalry charges, or the sharp logic of a phalanx formation: the fortress city of Tyre. Located on a rocky island about 800 meters off the coast of what is now Lebanon, Tyre was the jewel of Phoenicia. Wealthy, proud, and nearly impregnable, it had for centuries been a naval and commercial power, renowned for its ships, the trade of purple dye, and its cultural influence. Tyre did not openly rebel, but neither did it submit. Determined not to leave enemies at his rear while advancing toward Egypt, Alexander decided the city had to fall, and the world would witness one of the most remarkable sieges of antiquity. Tyre was a floating fortress. Its walls rose directly from the sea, making any approach by land extremely difficult. Furthermore, its powerful fleet and naval alliances with Carthage made it a fortress in constant motion. Upon learning of Alexander's approach, the Tyrians adopted an ambiguous stance. They declared neutrality but refused to open their gates to the conqueror. Alexander offered to perform sacrifices at the local temple of Melkart, the Phoenician deity associated with Heracles, whom Alexander claimed as a mythological ancestor. The Tyrians refused, fearing the gesture would be used as a political pretext for domination. For Alexander, the refusal was more than an offense. It was a personal challenge, a test of authority. He then resolved to take the city at any cost, even if it meant building a path through the sea. The plan seemed insane: to construct an artificial causeway linking the mainland to the island of Tyre, using stones, sand, and timber, turning the sea into solid ground beneath the army's feet. Alexander mobilized thousands of laborers, engineers, and soldiers for the task. They used ruins from ancient mainland Tyre to raise the mole, which slowly advanced into the sea. With each meter built, the Tyrians counterattacked with arrows, stones, boiling oil, and fire. When the causeway was nearly complete, Phoenician ships attacked and destroyed part of the structure, setting fire to wooden towers and killing workers. Alexander then rebuilt what was lost with even greater determination. He ordered taller siege towers equipped with catapults and covered in wet leather for fire protection. He also constructed an improvised port to anchor allied ships, forming a fleet with vessels from Sidon, Byblos, and other already subjugated Phoenician cities. The siege now occurred both by land and by sea. With every new obstacle, Alexander responded with relentless creativity. He ordered the sea floor to be dredged to prevent Tyrians from sending ships beneath the mole, deployed floating battering rams to strike the island's walls, and trained divers to cut submerged chains. The siege turned into a war of ingenuity. 7 months of fighting consumed resources, men, and time, but Alexander never considered retreating. His reputation was on the line. If Tyre resisted, other cities in the east might be inspired to believe the tide of conquest could be reversed. So he turned the siege into a matter of honor and authority. When the walls finally fell, after heavy bombardments and coordinated assaults from land and sea, the entry was ferocious. Macedonian soldiers stormed the streets of Tyre with fury accumulated over months of resistance. It is estimated that about 8,000 citizens were killed. Over 30,000 were enslaved. 7,000 Tyrian soldiers were crucified along the beach as a warning to any city that dared resist again. Yet Alexander, while showing fury, also preserved symbols. The Temple of Melkart was spared. The sacrifice that had been denied at the start of the campaign was finally performed, now under total domination. Alexander entered the sanctuary not as a supplicant but as a victor, almost as an incarnation of Heracles himself. The gesture, once again, was filled with meaning. For him, military triumph had to be followed by symbolic legitimization. It was not enough to conquer physically. One had to reorder the signs and narratives, inserting oneself as the sacred continuity. By making offerings to Melkart, Alexander was not just celebrating his victory, he was asserting himself as a divine figure on foreign soil, recognized not merely as a king, but as a predestined being. The fall of Tyre had immense repercussions. Politically, it eliminated the last Phoenician resistance and ensured complete control over the Levantine coast, opening the path to Egypt. Militarily, it showed the world that no physical or logistical obstacle was too great for Alexander. Culturally, the victory marked a moment of integration, with Alexander being honored in once hostile cities and revered by populations that recognized his genius. The city of Tyre, once a fortress at sea, had been torn from the water and from ancient history, placed under the feet of a new empire. And in the wake of its ruins, Alexander marched forward, now with his next target in mind, the Egypt of the pharaohs. After 7 months of resistance in Tyre and the subsequent brutal surrender of Gaza, another strategic fortress on the coast, Alexander the Great turned his gaze southward toward Egypt. In 332 before Christ, the land of the pharaohs was still officially a satrapy of the Persian Empire, ruled by a satrap appointed by Darius III. However, after the consecutive defeats of the Persian monarch and Alexander's growing prestige among the eastern peoples, Egypt had become a vulnerable province, both militarily and politically. When the Macedonian army crossed the Sinai Desert and approached the Nile Delta, it met no resistance. On the contrary, the Egyptians, weary of Persian domination and deeply respectful of divine authority, welcomed Alexander with enthusiasm and reverence. His entrance into Memphis was marked by public acclamations, religious offerings and processions, as if he were the rightful liberator sent by the gods. The Egyptian acceptance of Alexander has deep roots in the country's political and religious imagination. Pharaohs were seen not merely as leaders, but as incarnations of divinity, intermediaries between gods and men. When Alexander immediately adopted royal symbols, respected local cults, and participated in religious ceremonies, he presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the natural successor of the pharaonic lineage. He visited temples, made offerings to Amun, the sun god, and ensured that local priests were kept in their positions. This strategically respectful attitude toward Egyptian tradition consolidated his political standing without the need for violence. The Egyptian people not only accepted Alexander, they began to see him as part of their sacred continuity. In a matter of months, he was not only ruler of Egypt, but also recognized as a quasi-divine figure within the local symbolic system. But the most remarkable episode of his time in Egypt would be the foundation of a new city, Alexandria. Located between the western Nile Delta and the Mediterranean Sea, near the old village of Rakotis, the site was chosen with strategic precision. Alexander wanted a city that would be a link between East and West, a port for Greek and Egyptian ships, a military, commercial, administrative, and intellectual hub. He himself outlined the city's borders with flour on the sand, a legendary gesture, rich in symbolism, as if he were drawing the map of his empire with his own hands. Alexandria would be the city of fusion, where Greek culture would meet Egyptian wisdom, where philosophers would walk alongside priests, and where the light of knowledge would shine for centuries. Although Alexander would not live to see the city completed, his legacy within it would be eternal. Alexandria would become the cultural capital of the Hellenistic world, home to the greatest library of antiquity. and a meeting point for astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, historians, geographers, and poets. Its foundation reflected Alexander's mind, conquering yet also organizing, civilizing, and visionary. While other emperors built fortresses, he founded centers of thought. Alexandria was not just a city, it was a materialized worldview. And the simple fact of placing it in Egypt, one of the most ancient cradles of civilization, showed that Alexander did not seek to erase the past, but to integrate it, reinterpret it, and place it in the service of a new horizon. During his stay in Egypt, Alexander also undertook one of the most symbolic journeys of his life, crossing the Libyan desert to the Siwa oasis to consult the famous oracle of Amun. The journey, hundreds of kilometers under scorching heat, sandstorms, and unseen dangers, was interpreted by his contemporaries as a sacred pilgrimage. At the temple, the priests of Amun received him with honors and called him son of the god. Alexander did not deny it, and perhaps had no doubts. For him, that recognition was not merely personal honor. It was the final consecration of his divine authority. From that moment on, his public image would be carefully constructed around a semi-divine identity. In Asia, he was the son of Zeus, in Egypt, the son of Amun, and in his heart, he believed he was both. The conquest of Egypt, therefore, was not merely a military occupation. It was one of the highest points of Alexander's policy of integration. Unlike other conquerors who imposed their values by force, Alexander absorbed, adapted, and reorganized local systems within a broader, almost universal empire. Egypt, under his rule, flourished culturally and maintained its religious traditions intact, now under a new sovereign who claimed to be the son of the gods and heir to the pharaohs. With this, the Macedonian king left Egypt not only with another province under control, but with a new title, a new imperial center, and a new image of himself. He was no longer just Lord of Greece and Asia Minor. He was also the son of Amun, crowned by the desert itself. The year was 331 before Christ. After the conquest of Egypt and the founding of the grand city of Alexandria, Alexander marched back toward the heart of the Persian Empire. His destination was Babylon, but the true obstacle between him and Darius III's throne was a vast open plain called Gaugamela near the city of Arbela in Mesopotamia. It was there that Darius chose to make his final stand. Deeply wounded by his defeat at Issus, the Persian king had spent 2 years rebuilding his army, recruiting troops from all parts of the empire, from India to Anatolia. He chose Gaugamela precisely for its geography, an open field, ideal for maneuvering war chariots, cavalry, and large formations. Darius bet that with enough space, he could finally exploit his numerical superiority. It is estimated that his army exceeded 200,000 soldiers. Alexander, by contrast, had between 40 and 50,000 men, a clear minority. But within that apparent inferiority lay the decisive advantage, Alexander's tactical genius. Before the battle, Darius prepared the field like a trap. He ordered the terrain leveled so his chariots, armed with scythe blades on their wheels, could run freely. He arranged his troops in a semicircular formation and placed war elephants among the ranks, a display of both visual and psychological power. He wanted Alexander to see the field and hesitate, but Alexander did not hesitate. He spent days analyzing the terrain, studying formations and adapting his strategy. He knew he couldn't allow his army to be encircled. He knew that if he faced Darius head-on, the avalanche of numbers would crush him. His solution, as always, was controlled audacity. He would attack where the enemy was strongest, but in the least expected way. He would shift his troops to the right, forcing Darius to stretch his line and open a gap that could be exploited. It was a game of patience, precision, and absolute confidence in his officers. On the morning of the battle, Alexander mounted his horse Bucephalus, placed his helmet on his head, and took his position on the right wing, commanding the companion cavalry. Parmenion, his veteran general, led the left flank. The phalanxes stood in the center, compact and imposing. When the Persians advanced with their elephants and chariots tearing through the ground, Alexander remained calm. He ordered his troops to part and let the chariots pass, then surround and neutralize them quickly. The lateral movement he had planned began to take effect. The right wing advanced at an angle, drawing part of the Persian army away from the center. Darius, anxious to stop the maneuver, stretched his lines. and in doing so, opened a fatal gap in the center of his formation. Alexander saw the opportunity, rallied his elite cavalry, and charged with ferocity toward the heart of the battlefield, toward Darius himself. The pressure was so intense that the Persian king panicked. Once again, Darius turned his back and fled the battlefield, and with him fled the hope of a Persian victory. The Persian center collapsed. While Alexander pursued Darius, the other flanks of the army continued fighting. The Macedonian left wing, under heavy attack from the enemy cavalry, was under severe pressure, and for a moment the outcome was uncertain. But Alexander, sensing the risk, broke off the pursuit of the fleeing king and rushed back to assist Parmenion, restoring order and securing victory. By the end of the day, the field of Gaugamela was covered with thousands of Persian corpses. Darius's military structure had been destroyed, his troops were scattered, his prestige irreparably ruined, and Alexander was no longer just a conqueror on campaign, he was the new lord of Asia. The victory at Gaugamela was Alexander's military pinnacle. No other battle would so clearly display his strategic brilliance, his ability to read the battlefield in 3 dimensions, to anticipate enemy movements, to wield geography, psychology, and discipline as weapons. He had not won by force alone. He had won because he could see the invisible. The battle proved to the world that he was more than a talented general. He was an architect of war, a master of possibilities and limitations. With this victory, the road was open to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the great administrative, cultural, and spiritual centers of the Persian Empire. In less than a decade, Alexander had done the unthinkable. He had toppled a millennia-old empire, defeated an overwhelmingly superior army, and redrawn the map of the world. After the battle, Alexander entered Babylon as a liberator. He was received with pomp, offerings, and crowds. The city, which for centuries had symbolized Eastern splendor, now bowed to the Macedonian king. Shortly after, Susa opened its gates and handed over its treasure. Dozens of tons of gold, silver, and jewels accumulated by generations of Persian kings. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire, would also fall soon after. The collapse of the Persian world was inevitable. Darius, now a fugitive and increasingly isolated, tried to gather support, but his own men began to conspire against him. Alexander, for his part, did not rest. He continued his march. Because Gaugamela was not the end. It was merely the summit from which he could see the rest of the world he still longed to conquer. The victory at Gaugamela had done more than destroy an army. It had shattered the central pillar of the Persian Empire. Without military cohesion, prestige, or moral authority, Darius III was transformed from absolute monarch into a desperate fugitive, clinging to the last remnants of his influence. After the battle, Alexander marched south, entering Babylon in triumph, one of the oldest and most symbolic cities in the world. There he was received as a legitimate king, took part in religious rituals, offered sacrifices in local temples, and ensured traditions were respected. Babylon was not looted. On the contrary, Alexander preserved and honored it, reinforcing his image as a conciliatory and civilizing sovereign. This approach would be repeated in Susa, which also surrendered without a fight, delivering not only the city, but also the vast royal treasures accumulated by Persian kings. It is estimated that in Susa alone, Alexander seized over 50,000 talents of gold and silver, a wealth unimaginable, enough to fund the rest of his campaign. The next step was Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire and symbolic center of Achaemenid power. The city was sacred to the Persians, a place where coronation rituals and worship of Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian god, took place among marble palaces, giant columns, and sculpted reliefs of imperial domination. Alexander captured the city in 330 before Christ, facing little resistance, as the defenses were morally devastated. For months he remained there, contemplating the symbols of the empire he had brought down, and then he made a controversial decision. He ordered the burning of Xerxes' palace, a symbolic act of vengeance for the Greco-Persian wars, during which the Persians had burned Athens. Some sources say the act was fueled by alcohol, during a banquet where his companion Thais incited him to destroy the city. Others argue it was a political gesture, a way of signaling to the world that the Persian era was over. The fire that consumed Persepolis lit the sky for days, and with it burned the heart of a millennia-old empire. Meanwhile, Darius fled eastward toward the regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, now parts of Iran, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. He desperately tried to gather forces, but was increasingly seen as a defeated king. Many local satraps began aligning with Alexander or remaining neutral. The loyalty Darius once inspired evaporated with each passing mile. Among those still accompanying him, conspiracies began to form. The most prominent leader among them was Bessus, satrap of Bactria, who saw in Darius's downfall a chance to seize power. At a certain point during the flight, Darius was betrayed, imprisoned by his own men, and bound in a chariot. When Alexander finally approached the rebel group, the conspirators, terrified by his pursuit, stabbed Darius and abandoned his body on the roadside. Upon finding the body of the last Persian king, Alexander had an unexpected reaction. Instead of celebrating, he wept. He declared official mourning, held solemn funerals, and ordered that Darius be buried with full royal honors, as if he were still the legitimate sovereign. This gesture, deeply political, was also strategic. Alexander knew he needed the Persian aristocracy by his side to govern such vast territory. By treating Darius with posthumous dignity, he sent a clear message. He was no barbarian, but the new legitimate lord of Persia, one who respected the lineage and now assumed its crown. From that moment on, Alexander was no longer just a conqueror from the west. He became king of Asia, successor to the Achaemenids, heir to the Eastern throne and master of both worlds. With Darius's death and the collapse of central Persian resistance, Alexander began a new phase of his journey, consolidating the conquered empire. He assumed Persian royal titles, dressed in Eastern court garments, adopted local customs, and appointed Persians to trusted positions. This policy of cultural fusion, though met with suspicion by Macedonian officers, was part of his imperial vision. Alexander understood he could not rule over millions of Easterners as a foreigner. He had to become one of them, at least partially. This process would include mixed marriages, hybrid ceremonies, and the attempt to create a blended aristocracy. He no longer saw his mission as a mere sequence of battles. He saw himself as the architect of a new world, where West and East would merge into something greater, more lasting, more universal. The fall of Darius was not just the end of a man or a dynasty. It marked the end of an imperial model built on distance, heredity, and cultural segregation. By taking over the empire, Alexander initiated a radical experiment in syncretism, in which Greek soldiers would marry Persian women, gods would be reinterpreted, and languages and traditions would intertwine. The known world was entering a new era, forged in the flames of Persepolis and sealed in the tomb of the last Persian king. And at the center of this new world stood a young king born in Macedonia, educated by Aristotle, a dreamer like Achilles, and now more powerful than any man had ever been before. After the death of Darius III, Alexander did not merely inherit the lands of the greatest empire of antiquity, he inherited a title laden with mystical weight and divine authority, King of Kings. That was how Achaemenid monarchs presented themselves to the world, sovereigns of sovereigns, rulers of many peoples, holders of the heavenly mandate to govern the earth. And Alexander, by burying Darius with full imperial honors and assuming his throne, was not just conquering Persia physically, he began to personify it symbolically. This transition from Western warrior to Eastern sovereign was not an automatic process, but a deliberate one, meticulously constructed in every gesture, decree, ceremony, and public image. Alexander did not want to merely replace the former king. He wanted to be recognized as his legitimate successor, and for that he needed to wear the crown, adopt the customs, and restructure the empire with his own signature. One of the first and most significant steps was adopting the Persian throne in its entirety. Not just the title, but the etiquette, clothing, and rituals. Alexander began wearing the ceremonial robes of the Achaemenid court, which included long tunics, elaborate jewelry, golden sandals, and the traditional Persian tiara. He ordered the construction of a mixed court, bringing together Greek and Persian advisors, and launched a program to educate young Eastern nobles in the Greek language and Hellenic ways. At the same time, his Macedonian generals and officers were encouraged to adopt Eastern customs, including proskinesis, the traditional Persian gesture of reverence toward the king. This measure sparked resistance. Many of Alexander's soldiers and close companions saw it as a betrayal of Greek values, which despised blind adulation and valued citizen freedom. But Alexander insisted he was no longer just king of Macedonia. He was ruler of a larger, vaster, more complex world. This effort of integration was not merely symbolic. Alexander implemented a true administrative reorganization of the empire. He appointed local governors, retaining many original satraps as long as they pledged loyalty. He established mixed marriages between his military elite and noble Persian families. He himself married Roxana, daughter of a powerful lord of Bactria, not for romance, but for strategy. She was a living bridge between the conqueror and the peoples of the East. These matrimonial alliances had profound political meaning, as they solidified pacts, diffused rebellions, and created blood ties between cultures. Alexander also promoted public events, where Persian and Macedonian troops jointly participated in celebrations, training sessions, and oaths. It was an attempt to forge a new imperial army that was not just Greek, but truly multicultural. As King of Kings, Alexander also assumed the religious responsibilities of the title. He participated in local cults, respected Zoroastrians, offered sacrifices in Iran's ancestral temples, and at the same time preserved the worship of Greek gods. This coexistence of pantheons was part of his universalist vision. He saw local deities not as rivals, but as different faces of the same cosmic order. He believed that the gods of Egypt, Persia, and Greece could coexist under his empire, just as the peoples who worshipped them. This belief shaped both his external and internal policies, allowing Alexander to govern culturally diverse territories without enforcing uniformity. His vision was one of convergence, not homogenization. And although advanced for his time, it also caused discomfort among the more conservative sectors of his army, who could not grasp the full scope of the project their king was building. But Alexander's transformation into King of Kings did not mean abandoning his warrior essence. On the contrary, with the title came the responsibility to maintain order, suppress revolts, and expand borders. There was still resistance in the eastern regions of the empire, especially in Sogdiana and Bactria. Nomadic tribes, local leaders, and some generals who had once served Darius continued to challenge Macedonian rule. Alexander responded with swift, violent, and precise campaigns. He built fortresses, founded cities, and left garrisons to secure control. But he also made gestures of clemency and integration, offering administrative positions to those who surrendered and punishing traitors exemplarily. The balance between strength and diplomacy was constant. Governing Persia required more than military victories. It required intelligence, patience, and long-term vision. And Alexander, still young, seemed to master all these dimensions with uncanny ease. By assuming the title of King of Kings, Alexander left behind the image of the impetuous young warrior from Macedonia and stepped into the role of imperial archetype. His name was spoken in different languages. His face was stamped on coins of various styles, his likeness sculpted in temples and palaces from Egypt to the banks of the Indus River. He was no longer just a man. He was an idea, a model, a new form of power. And in this phase of his empire, Alexander truly believed he had been chosen to unite the known world under a single order. Not an order based on blind submission, but on civilizing integration. Persia, once the Eastern pride, was now a living part of the Alexandrian Empire, and the world in his hands seemed smaller, more connected, more mutable. But what Alexander did not yet realize was that the higher he rose as a universal figure, the more distant he became from the understanding of his own companions, and that the tension between the grandeur of empire and the limits of human nature was about to intensify. After officially assuming the title of King of Kings and consolidating his control over the central regions of the Persian Empire, Alexander would enter a new phase of his campaign, the challenge of the East. His earlier conquests, although grand, had focused on relatively structured areas under Achaemenid command, cities with centralized administrations, urban elites, and bureaucratic systems that could be assimilated with relative ease. But now, as he crossed the Zagros Mountains, the young emperor was stepping into a very different world. Ahead of him lay the mountainous, isolated, and untamed regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, territories that today belong to Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. There, the challenges would not be formal armies or walled cities. They would be ambushes, tribal resistance, asymmetric warfare, and unforgiving climates. It was the beginning of a war with no fixed frontiers, one that would require not only force but reinvention. Crossing the Zagros Mountains was, in itself, one of the most difficult undertakings of the campaign. The mountain range is vast, inhospitable, and treacherous. The armies marched along steep trails, narrow gorges, facing sudden snowstorms, supply shortages, and sporadic attacks by local warriors who knew the terrain like no one else. Alexander, far from retreating or cowering, used the challenge as part of his imperial pedagogy. He marched alongside the soldiers, shared the cold, hunger, and exhaustion. He made it a point to demonstrate that the emperor was one of them, someone who would never demand sacrifices he himself would not endure. This attitude forged an almost mystical loyalty between him and his army. Even in the most extreme conditions, the men followed Alexander with the certainty that they were building something greater than life itself. Upon crossing the Zagros and entering Bactria, Alexander encountered fierce resistance. Unlike the luxurious Persian capitals, the eastern cities were scattered fortifications, tied by tribal alliances and led by proud local chieftains, many of whom had sworn loyalty to Darius and now saw Alexander as an invader. Among the rebel leaders stood Bessus, the same man who had murdered Darius III and was now trying to proclaim himself king as a way to legitimize his leadership among the eastern peoples. Alexander declared Bessus a usurper and traitor and launched a relentless pursuit. Geography was not on his side. The mountainous terrain, deep valleys, frozen rivers, and the mobility of the tribes made the advance slow and exhausting. But Alexander, as always, adapted to the environment. He divided his army into mobile columns, used local spies, exploited internal alliances, and rewarded betrayals among the rebels to weaken their resistance. The Eastern campaign revealed Alexander's most methodical and patient side. Unlike the swift victories at Issus or Gaugamela, here he had to conquer every village, every gorge, every supply route. He founded new cities in strategic locations, many named Alexandria, that functioned as administrative and military hubs, ensuring lasting control over unstable regions. He also recruited local soldiers, training them in Macedonian methods, creating mixed battalions, and promoting Eastern officers within his command structure. The empire was no longer a foreign occupation, but gradually becoming a multicultural construction. But that came at a cost. Many of his generals from Macedonia and Greece began to express discontent. They did not understand why Alexander dressed like a Persian, married a local woman, and allowed barbarians to hold leadership positions in the army. Tensions grew. The emperor was no longer one of their equals. He had become a distant, almost divine figure, incomprehensible to many. This estrangement would intensify with the capture of Bessus. Betrayed by his own allies and handed over to Alexander, the former satrap was tried and executed for regicide. The trial was public, and Alexander insisted on applying Persian laws, showing that his authority was not arbitrary, but rooted in Eastern tradition. In doing so, he made it clear that he was no longer merely the heir of Philip of Macedonia, but the legitimate successor of the Achaemenid lineage. The execution of Bessus was not just punishment, it was a symbolic affirmation. Alexander was the sole legitimate lord of Asia, and anyone else who claimed to be king would be treated as an impostor. But this act also marked the end of an era. The easy conquests were over. Now the empire advanced slowly, at the cost of attrition, internal tensions, and the growing difficulty of maintaining unity between Western soldiers and Eastern peoples. Even in the face of all these challenges, Alexander continued to move forward. He climbed mountains, crossed frozen rivers, faced deserts and local resistance. Every kilometer conquered was marked by a new fortress, a new road, a new city. He was not just conquering land, and he was transforming space into civilization. He created trade routes, encouraged cultural intermarriage, built libraries and observatories, promoting a new model of empire. But in doing so, he also planted the seeds of internal wear. Soldiers missed home, questioned the endless war, and felt alienated by the customs they were now expected to adopt. The figure of Alexander, once inspiring, began to evoke fear and doubt. He was drifting further from his human condition and closer to myth. The resistance in the East, therefore, was not just a military stage. It was a mirror of the empire Alexander sought to build. Vast, diverse, unstable, but with a centralizing logic built around the figure of a man who saw himself as a mediator between the gods and the peoples of the earth. The crossing of the Zagros Mountains did not merely divide geographies, it also separated Alexander from his equals. The King of Kings now walked alone, ahead of a world that followed him with admiration, fear, and growing incomprehension. As Alexander's empire expanded beyond the limits any king had ever dared to imagine, a new task emerged, not just to conquer, but to unify. After defeating armies, subjugating cities, and crossing mountain ranges, the true challenge became keeping together a territory made up of dozens of peoples, languages, religions, and traditions. Alexander understood that the power of the sword had limits. An empire could not be sustained by force alone, but by social, cultural, and symbolic bonds. It was in this context that he launched an ambitious and unprecedented effort in ancient history, an attempt to merge East and West into a single political, religious, and human body, a civilizational project that inevitably required union between people. And the most powerful and symbolic tool in this process was marriage. Alexander's first union with an Eastern woman was not by chance. Roxana, daughter of Oxyates, lord of Bactria, was not only a woman of striking beauty, she was the key to pacifying a strategic region of the empire. Their marriage was neither secret nor treated as a private affair. It was a political spectacle, carefully staged, where love and diplomacy danced together with clear intent. By marrying Roxana, Alexander didn't just secure the loyalty of mountain clans, he symbolized the union between conqueror and conquered. By treating her as a legitimate queen, Alexander sent a clear message. The women of the East were not mere concubines to a foreign ruler, but queens of a new world. The ceremony, carried out with both Persian and Macedonian rites, was a living metaphor for the cultural integration Alexander dreamed of building. But this isolated gesture would not be enough. A few years later, during his stay in Susa, Alexander took an even bolder step. He organized a collective marriage between about 80 of his Macedonian officers and women of the Persian nobility. He himself took 2 additional Persian wives, Statera, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes III, symbolically uniting himself with the last 2 Persian royal dynasties. The ceremony, known as the Susa weddings, was a monumental event. Thousands participated. Public feasts were held, golden supplies were distributed, theatrical performances were staged, and parades of mixed troops took place. The marriages were legitimate and sealed long-term political alliances. Alexander hoped that from these unions would emerge a new elite, mixed race, bilingual, bicultural, capable of governing the empire cohesively, blending Hellenic discipline with Eastern nobility. But not everyone welcomed the project. Many soldiers saw these marital alliances as a threat to Greek identity. Macedonian officers, used to seeing themselves as superior conquerors, resisted the idea of marrying barbarians and becoming their equals. There was distrust, prejudice, and in some cases open repulsion. The marriages, instead of uniting, exposed internal fractures within the army. Some generals who took part in the ceremony later abandoned their wives or treated them as inferiors. Alexander, indignant, reinforced the legitimacy of the unions and demanded respect for the new queens of the empire. But the truth was clear. His vision was far more advanced than the spirit of his time. He was trying to force a civilizational synthesis where many still saw only territorial conquest. Alexander's attempt at cultural unification went far beyond marriages. He promoted the teaching of Greek in remote regions, but also encouraged his soldiers to learn local languages. He introduced Eastern cults into Macedonian festivals and integrated Persian priests into his court. He founded cities with hybrid administrative models, where temples to Greek gods coexisted with Zoroastrian or Egyptian sanctuaries. The coins minted during his reign bore hybrid symbols: Persian lions beside Zeus, inscriptions in Aramaic script with Hellenic portraits. It was the materialization of a new type of empire, not based on unilateral domination, but on fusion, on symbiosis, on plural identity. Alexander did not want to merely rule the world, he wanted to redesign it from within. However, the tension between ideal and reality kept growing. Eastern populations saw Alexander as a respectable king, but many still regarded him as a foreigner. Meanwhile, his own men began to feel betrayed. as if the glory they had earned with the sword was being traded for diplomatic marriages, forced customs, and alien traditions. The cultural fusion was at once magnificent and fragile. Alexander walked a fine line between innovation and instability. The empire he sought to build was perhaps too great to be understood in a single lifetime. And the attempt to merge two worlds, Hellenic and Eastern, became both a historical revolution and a constant emotional battlefield. Through marriage and cultural reform, Alexander sought to shape an empire that was not only vast, but cohesive, a world where the son of a Macedonian and a Persian princess could rule both a city on the Euphrates and a port on the Mediterranean. But to achieve this, he had to maintain absolute authority, contain resentments, and most importantly, keep the flame of loyalty alive in hearts that were beginning to grow weary. The war against the East might have ended, but the war against internal fragmentation was just beginning. With Persia under his control and the cultural fusion in full motion, Alexander the Great turned his gaze to the most distant horizon, the Indus Valley. For the Greeks of the time, India was a land of mysteries, infinite wealth, sacred rivers, exotic animals, and incomprehensible gods. In the narratives inherited from the writings of Herodotus and Anatolian trade expeditions, this region was described as a world apart, a place where the sun rose earlier, the people looked different, and the edges of the world dissolved. For Alexander, conquering India meant not only expanding his empire to the easternmost frontiers, but confronting the ultimate limits of geography and divinity. He did not march merely through lands. He marched toward the sacred, the unreachable, the mythical. The Indian campaign would become his deepest journey, his most enigmatic, and perhaps his most transformative. The journey toward India was anything but simple. The regions of Central Asia, especially Sogdiana and Bactria, still harbored tribal resistance and political instability. To move forward, Alexander had to secure trade routes, found new cities, establish garrisons, and reinforce the loyalty of local commanders. In this context, beyond occasional battles, he intensified mixed marriages and the training of native troops, aiming to create an army that was truly Asian, both in composition and in custom. The growing presence of Persian, Sogdian, and Bactrian officers increasingly irritated the Macedonian veterans, who saw their king drifting from Hellenic tradition in favor of an increasingly abstract imperial ideal. Yet Alexander pressed on. Each step eastward was a physical, cultural, and psychological challenge, and he embraced them all, convinced that his destiny knew no borders. Crossing the peaks of the Hindu Kush, Alexander faced extreme conditions: snowstorms, avalanches, water shortages, and deaths from exhaustion. Many of his men perished without facing combat, victims of the merciless terrain. But as in previous trials, the king marched with them, leading from horseback, sharing rations, risking his own life to rescue wounded soldiers. This closeness, though increasingly rare with the passing years, remained one of the few bonds that kept his army united. When they finally reached the Indus Valley, they found a fertile region dotted with fortified cities and independent kingdoms. There was no cohesive Indian empire, rather a complex network of local rulers, among whom stood out King Porus, lord of the Paurava kingdom, on the far side of the Hydaspes River. To him, Alexander would issue the greatest challenge of his eastern campaign. The Battle of the Hydaspes, fought in 326 before Christ, would become one of Alexander's most difficult. For the first time, he faced a force equipped with war elephants, colossal beasts, armed and trained to crush infantry ranks and instill psychological terror in enemies. The Hydaspes River, wide and unstable, separated the two armies. Porus, confident in his position, believed Alexander would not dare to cross during the monsoon season, but the conqueror did the unthinkable. He led his troops across the river at night, in a remote location, using rafts, ropes, and total silence. At dawn, the Indians awoke to find the Macedonian army already in battle formation, ready to strike. The combat was bloody, prolonged, and chaotic. The elephants caused devastation, but were eventually surrounded and neutralized with arrows and coordinated maneuvers. Porus fought bravely, even after most of his personal guard had been killed. When he was captured, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus's reply became legendary: like a king. Impressed by his courage and dignity, Alexander not only spared him, he returned his kingdom and granted him new lands. This gesture reinforced the model of leadership Alexander was striving to consolidate, an empire based on mutual admiration, where defeated kings became respected allies, provided they demonstrated honor and bravery. But although the victory over Porus was a tactical and symbolic triumph, it also marked the beginning of the end of expansion. After Hydaspes, Alexander wanted to push further east in search of the mythical Ganges River, where unknown peoples, legendary creatures, and golden cities supposedly awaited. But his army, worn out from years of marching and fighting, refused to continue. The soldiers demanded to return. Many had been away from home for over a decade. They had buried brothers, sons, and friends. They had married, been wounded, grown old. Now faced with tropical jungles, unbearable humidity, and the prospect of even more unfamiliar wars, they said enough. Alexander, for the first time, wept before his men, but he relented. The march into India, although incomplete, cemented Alexander's image as a man who challenged the impossible. There were no lands he would not dare to tread, nor gods he would not attempt to understand. During his stay in India, he performed sacrifices to local deities, studied native philosophies, and spoke with ascetics and sages. He was particularly fascinated by the gymnosophists, naked philosophers who meditated under the sun, renouncing material pleasures and cultivating mastery of mind over body. Some accounts say Alexander even tried to convince one of them to accompany him back west, so deep was his curiosity about the wisdom of this unknown world. It was as if, after conquering every possible territory, he now sought to conquer the boundaries of the human mind. On the return journey, Alexander did not choose the easy route. Instead of retracing the safe northern path, he decided to cross the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most arid and lethal regions of the ancient world. Many of his men died of thirst, exhaustion, and malnutrition. But this extreme route was more than a logistical decision. It was a test of willpower, endurance, and faith in his own destiny. The Indian campaign had transformed Alexander. He was no longer the young king of Macedonia, nor merely the lord of Asia. In his mind he had become a demigod, and in his heart a pilgrim in search of the absolute. In 326 before Christ, on the banks of the mighty Hydaspes River, Alexander would face one of the greatest military challenges of his entire career. The confrontation with King Porus, sovereign of the Paurava kingdom, a respected leader among the peoples of northwest India, and commander of an army with tactics and weaponry unknown to Western forces. Among those weapons were the feared war elephants, symbols of power, living mountains of muscle and ivory that, once trained for battle, became machines of destruction. Porus had gathered around 30,000 soldiers, over 200 elephants, and thousands of horses and archers. Alexander himself would later admit that the challenge was not only military, it was a confrontation with a different form of warfare, shaped by cultural codes and strategies foreign to Hellenic tradition. The crossing of the Hydaspes, the battle against Porus, and the final victory would become more than a clash. They would symbolize Alexander's definitive penetration into a world beyond the known world. The setting was daunting. The Hydaspes River, known today as the Jhelum in present-day Pakistan, was wide, fast-flowing, flanked by muddy banks and dense forests. The tropical climate, with constant rain, made movement slow and exhausting. Porus had stationed his army on the eastern bank of the river, trusting in the natural barrier of the water. He knew Alexander would have to cross and assumed it would be at a predictable point. But Alexander was unpredictable by nature. For days, he orchestrated diversionary maneuvers, feigning crossings in various places, while secretly planning the real passage dozens of kilometers upriver. On a night of torrential rain and lightning, with the roar of the waters masking the noise of the vessels, Alexander crossed the Hydaspes with part of his cavalry and light infantry. He set up a silent camp on the far bank and prepared the strike. When Porus learned that the enemy had crossed, he reacted swiftly. He assembled his elephants, cavalry, and infantry and marched to intercept the Macedonians. The battle would unfold on open ground, and Alexander knew he had to act strategically. He employed dynamic encirclement tactics. He kept his mobile cavalry on the flanks, provoking the Indians into disarray, and focused attacks on their rear. The elephants charged brutally, tearing through phalanxes and spreading panic, but the Macedonians, disciplined and adaptable, created escape corridors, used long spears to wound the animals' flanks, and surrounded them with archers and shield bearers. The battle lasted for hours. The rain turned the field into a bloody quagmire. Screams, neighs, the trumpeting of wounded elephants, and the metallic clang of weapons filled the air like a symphony of chaos. Porus fought with astonishing bravery. Mounted atop one of the largest elephants in the field, he led his troops like a true king-priest of the Vedic tradition, his body painted in blue and gold, his armor gleaming even under the mud. His presence commanded respect. He did not flee, did not falter, and even as his lines began to collapse, he stood firm. But the Macedonian pressure, the division of his troops, and the collapse of the center sealed the battle's outcome. Alexander's cavalry, after flanking the Indian forces, struck the final bastions of resistance and surrounded the king himself. Even encircled, Porus refused to surrender. He fought until he was captured, exhausted, wounded, but still standing. When brought before Alexander, the conqueror asked him how he wished to be treated. The answer was short, simple, and monumental. Like a king. Alexander, impressed by Porus's courage, dignity, and pride, not only spared his life, but restored him to the throne, now as an ally and governor of new territories under the empire. This gesture was not mere magnanimity, it was political calculation. Alexander understood that ruling culturally distant regions required not humiliation, but co-optation. Porus's nobility, respected among his peers, would now serve as a tool of stability and propaganda. India, even if only in its northwestern edge, was beginning to be integrated into the Hellenistic world. Cities were founded with Greek structures, officers were left to manage fortresses, and new coins were minted with bilingual inscriptions. But the cost of victory had been steep. Thousands of soldiers had died. The march to that point had been grueling. And now before the Hyphasis River, today's Bees, Alexander wanted to press on toward the Ganges. Yet his officers and soldiers refused. They were exhausted, traumatized, and homesick. The battle against Porus had been an apotheosis, but also the emotional limit for the army. Faced with his men's refusal, Alexander accepted the return. But his spirit would not rest. He erected 12 colossal altars along the Hyphasis, dedicated to Zeus, Heracles, and local Hindu deities, marking the furthest point of his conquest. There, the known world ended. Beyond that, it was said, lay dragons, immortal peoples, and endless seas. For Alexander, it was a bitter ending, but also the beginning of another cycle. The return would be long, harsh, and filled with trials. Yet India, with its sacred rivers, brave kings, and silent gods, had transformed the Macedonian king forever. He no longer belonged to any one people. He had become an empire in the shape of a man. After years of relentless marches, epic battles, and improbable victories, Alexander found himself facing an impasse that not even his military genius could overcome, the will of his own men. The soldiers' refusal to advance beyond the Hyphasis River, in what is now northern India, marked one of the most human and, paradoxically, most defining moments of the campaign to build the greatest empire of antiquity. There, the young king, who had defied Darius, burned Persepolis, founded Alexandria, and defeated Porus's war elephants, encountered an enemy that could not be conquered by the sword: exhaustion. His men were not just physically tired, they were spiritually depleted. They no longer fought for glory or territory, they fought to survive. And now, faced with humid jungles, tropical diseases, and the prospect of more battles against unknown enemies, they said no. Contemporary accounts describe the scene in tragic tones. Before the waters of the Hyphasis, Alexander built an altar, offered sacrifices to the gods, and tried to stir his soldiers with fiery speeches. He spoke of heroic deeds, eternal glory, cities yet to be conquered, and legends yet to be written. But the faces watching him had changed. Many of those men had fought alongside him since Macedonia, crossed the Hellespont, seen Thebes burn, marched under sun and snow, buried sons, brothers, comrades. They had eaten roots in the desert, drunk mud in the swamps, and lost pieces of themselves along the way. They were no longer the idealistic youths of the initial campaign. They were veterans, scarred inside and out. And when Alexander finished his speech, instead of cheers, there was silence. Parmenion, Clytus, and other veteran officers lowered their eyes. No general moved, no sword was raised. It was the end. Faced with this collective refusal, Alexander withdrew to his tent and remained silent for days. It was his only defeat, not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of his own men. And as he always did when faced with the impossible, he transformed pain into symbol. He erected 12 monumental altars along the hyphasis, each dedicated to a different god, symbolizing the boundary of his conquests. The altars served both as tributes to the gods and as eternal reminders of the point where his expansion stopped. Even today, archaeologists and historians search for the location of these altars, as if there lies the very line where the dream of absolute empire bowed to human limitation. Accepting the return, Alexander chose, as always, the hardest route. Instead of heading back north through known and safe paths, he decided to march south, following the course of the Indus River to the ocean. He wanted to explore new lands, chart rivers and tribes, found cities, and map what remained unknown. It was during this journey that he suffered a serious injury while scaling a wall alone and was struck in the chest by an arrow. He survived, but recovery was slow and painful. His soldiers, seeing him near death, wept openly. It was a reminder that Alexander, no matter how divine he appeared, still bled. He was still made of flesh. After recovering, he headed toward the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most arid and deadly regions of the ancient world. The crossing was marked by hunger, thirst, and death. It is estimated that 1/3 of the army perished in the desert. Men died under the sun, horses sank into the sand, supplies evaporated. Yet Alexander pressed on. When he received a helmet full of water, offered by his squires as a gesture of honor, he poured it onto the ground in front of his troops, refusing to drink unless they could drink too. That gesture became legendary. It showed that the king was not a distant tyrant, but still a warrior among warriors. Even amid tragedy, he maintained his aura. At the end of the crossing, Alexander reached the coastal regions of what is now Baluchistan, where he reunited with his fleet, led by Nearchus, who had sailed down the Indus River to the Indian Ocean and was now attempting a maritime return. The reconnection of land and naval forces was a rare logistical triumph, but it came with absolute exhaustion. It was the end of the road. The army had marched over 20,000 kilometers, crossed 3 continents, fought dozens of battles, and endured the harshest conditions. Now they returned not as adventurers, but as survivors. Alexander, faced with his conquered empire, no longer sought expansion. He sought administration. He ordered reconstruction efforts, the founding of new cities, military reforms, and the integration of conquered peoples. But something had changed. The fire of conquest had been replaced by the weight of maintenance. The soldiers' refusal at the hyphasis marked more than the end of a military march. It was the line that separated dream from reality. Alexander had gone farther than any man before him. But even the greatest of empires is constrained by human limits, and the silence of the soldiers on that distant bank of India would forever echo as the whisper that interrupted the roar of a king. After the soldiers refused to continue marching toward the Ganges and the subsequent return through India, Alexander the Great made a decision that remains a subject of debate among historians: to cross the Gedrosian Desert. This region, located between present-day Pakistan and southeastern Iran, was, and still is, one of the driest and most inhospitable areas on Earth. Even the ancient Persians avoided crossing it, even with small armies. There were no navigable rivers, no resupplied cities, no regular vegetation. It was a desert without shade, a labyrinth of sand, heat, and death. And it was precisely this path that Alexander chose for his return to Babylon. For some, it was a gesture of wounded pride, a test imposed on the soldiers who had refused him at the hyphasis. For others, it was a poorly calculated strategic decision. But for Alexander himself, it was a trial, a ritual of transcendence, a journey meant to test the ultimate limits of his leadership. The crossing began at the end of 325 before Christ. Alexander divided his forces into 3 parts: a naval fleet led by Nearchus, which would sail along the Arabian Sea coast to the Persian Gulf, a light land detachment that would follow the mountain routes, and the main force commanded by Alexander himself, which would cross the central desert. From the very first days, signs of the journey's brutality began to pile up. The sand burned beneath their feet. Supplies, carried by camels and mules, either spoiled or evaporated under the scorching heat. Wells were scarce and many were dry. Local guides lost the route, and the path became longer than expected. The landscape was monotonous, suffocating, and endless. Winds threw fine particles into eyes, throats, and lungs. The men slept on hard ground and woke covered in dust. The sun never relented, and hope began to melt. As the weeks passed, the accounts grew darker. Hundreds of men died from heat stroke. Others went mad from thirst and despair. Horses and camels, exhausted, were abandoned along the way, or sacrificed so their flesh and blood could be used as a last resort for sustenance. On some days, they advanced barely 2 kilometers. Those who walked at night suffered from freezing cold and complete darkness. As always, Alexander refused any privileges. He walked on foot when needed, refused water when the soldiers had none, tended to the wounded and buried the dead. One emblematic moment occurred when an officer found a small amount of water and placed it in a helmet to offer to the king. In silence, Alexander took the helmet and in front of everyone poured it onto the ground. "If my men cannot drink, neither will I." The scene swept through the corridors of despair like a lightning bolt of discipline and admiration. Even at the brink of collapse, Alexander was still the king. The crossing of the desert lasted over 2 months. It's estimated that about a third of the army perished on the way, not from war, but from thirst, disease, and exhaustion. Those who survived arrived in tatters at Carmania, a region of oases and fertile valleys where they could finally rest and regroup. There, Alexander held a celebration that shocked many. He paraded with his soldiers in festive garments, hosted public banquets, artistic performances, and offerings to the gods. Some saw this as a celebration of survival, a tribute to the dead, and a ritual of rebirth. Others interpreted it as the delirium of a king beginning to lose his grip on reality. It was hard to tell where genius ended and obsession began. But one fact remained. After crossing the Gedrosian desert, Alexander himself was no longer the same. Physically weakened, mentally distant, but still unbreakable, he resumed full command of the empire. His authority was now unquestionable, not only for his achievements, but because no living man had endured what he had. The desert had been his final baptism, a journey through the underworld, and the man who returned was not the same who had left. In Carmania, he reunited with Nearchus, who had completed the maritime expedition despite storms and hunger. The reconnection of the land and naval forces was hailed as a rare logistical feat. For the first time in history, a Western force had mapped and traversed the most dangerous routes of the East, by land and sea. It was a victory of epic proportions, but it also signaled that the empire had reached its saturation point. There were no more lands to conquer, only the burden of holding them. The crossing of the Gedrosian desert was thus the silent epilogue to Alexander's epic. There would be no more grand conquests afterward, only administration, political marriages, internal conflicts, and eventually physical decline. Gedrosia was his last great challenge, and also his final great victory. A bitter victory, made of bones in the sand and silence under the sun. A reminder that even the greatest empires in the world must cross deserts that cannot be won with weapons, but with endurance and faith. Alexander survived, but there, among the dunes and the corpses, something inside him remained buried forever. When Alexander finally returned to Babylon in the year 324 before Christ, the world was no longer the same, and neither was he. After more than a decade of conquests, epic battles, impossible crossings, and daring reforms, the Alexandrian Empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, spanning 3 continents, dozens of peoples, and thousands of kilometers of roads, routes, and borders. But while the body of the empire had been drawn by the sword, its soul remained fragile. Alexander understood that to preserve what he had conquered, he now had to govern, not with the urgency of war, but with the stability of time. And it was in Babylon, the mythical city on the banks of the Euphrates, that the King of Kings established his seat of power, transforming the heart of the ancient Eastern world into the capital of a new global order. Babylon was not chosen by chance. It was one of the oldest cities on earth, associated with astronomical knowledge, refined administration, and ancient religiosity. Alexander saw it as the ideal point of convergence between West and East. As soon as he arrived, he ordered the reconstruction of damaged temples, began urban reforms, expanded the royal palaces, and invested in hydraulic works to control the flooding of the river. He also announced the creation of an imperial port, from which goods could travel to the Persian Gulf, and from there reach routes to India and Arabia. His plan was clear: to transform Babylon not only into the headquarters of his empire, but into the logistical and spiritual link between all peoples under his rule. There, he hoped to gather governors, generals, priests, astronomers, engineers, and artists, a multicultural bilingual court where Greek and Aramaic would intermingle, just like the gods and their dreams. However, behind the appearance of glory and order, a shadow of tension was growing. The empire was swollen. The multiplicity of peoples began to create internal fractures. The Macedonian officers were dissatisfied with the increasing presence of Persian and Eastern soldiers in the army. There were rumors of plots, desertions, and silent assassinations. Many of the mixed marriages celebrated in Susa had ended in rejection. The soldiers wanted to go home. Others complained about Alexander's divine posture. He now appeared in ceremonial Persian garments, demanded proskinesis, the gesture of reverence, and spoke as if he were the son of the gods. For many, the king had lost himself. From hero of the homeland, he had become a distant, enigmatic, and incomprehensible figure. Alexander, for his part, seemed increasingly absorbed in grand and abstract plans. He ordered the construction of a new fleet to explore the coast of Arabia and sent expeditions to the Caspian Sea. He commissioned maps of the world, celestial cartographies, population censuses, and monetary unification projects between the regions of the empire. He was convinced that his mission was not yet complete. He spoke of invading Arabia, conquering the known world, and perhaps reaching the ocean that surrounded the earth, according to ancient cosmology. But at the same time that he dreamed of the infinite, he was surrounded by intrigue, exhaustion, and death. Several of his veteran generals had died or withdrawn. The grief over Hephaestion, his closest friend and probable lover, still consumed him. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander organized funerals worthy of a god and went days without eating. A part of his light went out in that moment. In Babylon, Alexander tried to contain the damage. He gathered his generals, reassigned commands, and held a public reconciliation ceremony between Macedonian officers and Persian troops, known as the Banquet of Harmony. During the event, all were to sit at the same table, drink the same wine, and make vows of brotherhood and mutual recognition. It was a powerful symbolic gesture, but many knew the unity was only apparent. The empire looked cohesive from the outside, but was fractured within. The foundations that supported Alexander, glory, loyalty, inspiration, were collapsing under the weight of years of war and the absence of stable roots. Even the gods seemed silent. Still, Alexander did not stop. Even with his weakened body, he continued issuing decrees, reviewing maps, and receiving ambassadors. He welcomed visitors from Ethiopia, India, Italy, and regions north of the Caspian Sea. All came to see the man who had conquered the world. And he received them with grandeur, but also with an increasingly distant gaze. There was something feverish in his gestures, a silent urgency, as if he knew time was slipping away. In dreams, he saw signs. In delirium, he spoke with gods. In meetings, he spoke of new realms, new cities, new deities, but his body was showing signs that the hardest journey was yet to come. In Babylon, Alexander had stopped conquering, but he had not stopped trying to transform the world. And that obsession, that attempt to touch the absolute, may have been his final battle. One fought not against an external enemy, but against the limits of a man who dared to walk where no one had ever set foot. Among all the losses Alexander faced during his long journey of glory and blood, none was as devastating as the death of Hephaestion. More than a general, more than a childhood friend, Hephaestion was the human reflection of Alexander's soul. The two grew up together in the Macedonian court, were educated by Aristotle, and shared campaigns, maps, fears, and dreams. They marched side by side from the Hellespont to the Indus, survived battles, deserts, and betrayals. Wherever Alexander was, Hephaestion was too, as his right arm, intimate advisor, and inseparable part of his existence. And when Hephaestion suddenly fell ill in Ecbatana, in the autumn of 324 before Christ, the fragility of an invincible empire was revealed in a single fevered bed. Ancient sources differ on the exact cause of death. Some say it was a sudden typhoid fever. Others report food poisoning from excessive meat and wine. There are also versions suggesting accidental poisoning from misadministered medicine. But in all versions, the outcome is the same. Hephaestion dies young at the peak of his strength in a distant city without warning, leaving Alexander devastated. It is said the king refused food for days. He tore his clothes in despair. He ordered the hair of not only his officers, but the entire army to be cut in mourning. And as if trying to deny reality, he began a series of tributes that surpassed the limits of the human. He commanded a colossal funeral pyre to be built, which would take months to erect in Babylon. He demanded that Hephaestion be declared a divine hero, a status reserved for demigods. Alexander's grief became public, but also ritualized. It was absolute sorrow, but also a performance of greatness. In Babylon, the construction of the funeral pyre consumed resources equivalent to a military campaign. Nearly all provinces sent rare materials: marble from Syria, cedar from Lebanon, Egyptian gold, sculptures from Phrygia, columns from Persia. The structure would exceed 60 meters in height, divided into 7 symbolic levels, each representing a sphere of the cosmos or a virtue of Hephaestion: courage, loyalty, nobility, friendship, wisdom, strength, and love. Around it, statues, fountains, columns, and even hanging gardens were placed. It was a temple to memory, a mausoleum of the soul. But the deepest dimension of Alexander's mourning was not in the stone. It was in the emptiness. The absence of Hephaestion echoed within him. Generals began to notice his increasing irritability, emotional outbursts, and unpredictable behavior. In meetings, he wept without warning. During sacrifices, he invoked gods he had never mentioned before. His dreams became more frequent and disturbing. Some records mention he began consulting oracles with growing urgency, seeking signs from beyond. He wondered if the gods were punishing him, if his greatness now demanded a price, if it would have been better to die before seeing his soul split in two. For many modern scholars, the relationship between Alexander and Hephaestion went beyond military friendship. There is evidence that they shared a deep, loving, and possibly physical intimacy. Even among the ancients, this hypothesis was accepted naturally. In a world where bonds between men could be stronger than blood, the connection between them was seen as a spiritual union. Hephaestion was the confidant of Alexander's most secret plans. He managed royal correspondence, mediated internal conflicts, calmed the king's rage. And now, without him, all that was unraveling. It was as if, in losing Hephaestion, Alexander lost his mirror, his reason, and his balance. The funeral, held months later in Babylon, was the largest ever recorded at the time. Thousands of soldiers marched in silence. Priests from multiple religions participated. Animals were sacrificed. Coins were cast into the fire. Alexander himself walked before the pyre wearing a white tunic, eyes hollow, with the expression of a statue. When the body was burned, it is said the king remained motionless for hours, as if waiting for the ashes to speak, as if refusing to accept that even gods die. In Hephaestion's memory, Alexander founded cities, renamed fortresses, and ordered every temple in the empire to offer sacrifices in his honor. It was a desperate attempt to preserve what death had undone. But the mourning did not heal. In the following months, Alexander sank into a state of restless agitation. He continued to work obsessively, with plans, decrees, expeditions, but with a forced energy. His eyes were sunken, his body weakened, his soul absent. The empire still existed, but the man who created it was already beginning to disappear from within. Hephaestion was not just the friend who was gone. He was the part of Alexander that believed in eternity, and his death sealed the certainty that even the gods bleed. In June of 323 before Christ, at the palace of Babylon, Alexander suddenly fell ill. He was only 32 years old. He was the most powerful man in the world, ruler of a colossal empire that stretched from Greece to the Indus Valley. His name was revered as that of a demigod. His deeds were already recounted as living myths, but all at once, the body that had endured battles, deserts, wounds, and impossible marches began to give in to a high and persistent fever. For days, Alexander fluctuated between delirium, chills, profuse sweating, and exhaustion. The doctors, perplexed, took turns at his bedside without success. The illness seemed to defy all logic, and with it, the fate of the world hung in the silence of a bed. The illness began after a banquet offered to his officers. Some accounts say Alexander felt a sharp pain after drinking wine. Others claim the fever gradually overtook him in the days that followed. What is certain is that, for 12 days, his condition worsened without cease. He could barely speak. He was carried on a litter to visit temples and still tried to dictate orders with a weakened voice. Even so, he maintained his presence before the soldiers. In a poignant scene, he was taken to the palace courtyard lying down, where hundreds of his men passed by in silence to see him one last time. Many wept upon seeing him so fragile. It was like watching a star fall in slow motion, like witnessing the end of an era. The causes of Alexander's death remain one of history's greatest mysteries. The hypotheses vary: malaria, typhoid fever, pancreatitis, liver infection, autoimmune disease, all plausible given the sanitary conditions, the body's exhaustion, and the history of injuries. But there are also theories of poisoning. Alexander was surrounded by intrigues. His rise had generated envy. His policy of cultural fusion created resentment, and his boundless ambition frightened even his allies. Some ancient historians suggested that Antipater, the regent of Macedonia, poisoned Alexander through his sons or allies. Others believe the wine may have been poisoned during Hephaestion's funeral rites as an act of vengeance. However, most modern scholars see physiological collapse as the more likely explanation, a body that endured the impossible for too long until it finally gave way. There is a curious detail that deepens the mystery. After his death, Alexander's body did not decompose for days. Many interpreted this as a sign of divinity. Others saw it as a clue of poisoning by toxins that delayed deterioration. Whatever the truth may be, the image of his incorrupt body became a symbol of the man who defied mortality, a hero not just remembered, but who resisted even the passage of time. His death, however, left behind an unsustainable vacuum. Alexander had no adult heirs. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child, Alexander IV, was still only a hope. The generals, the so-called diadochi, immediately entered into dispute. Ptolemy took his body and brought it to Egypt, where it would be mummified and displayed in a golden glass sarcophagus in Alexandria. Cassander, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and others divided the empire into regions, each claiming parts of his legacy. What had once been a unified empire fragmented into civil wars, assassinations, betrayals, and new dynasties. The world after Alexander would be shaped as much by his absence as by his presence. And yet, his shadow never disappeared. Cities bearing his name, and especially Alexandria in Egypt, flourished as centers of science, art, and commerce. Hellenism spread throughout Asia, influencing languages, currencies, architecture, and religions. Even in regions where his rule was brief, such as Afghanistan or northern India, cultural traces endured for centuries. His figure was adopted by Romans, Arabs, Persians, Indians, and even medieval kings who claimed to be his heirs. Alexander became myth, symbol, archetype, a man who dared to go beyond what was permitted, and who paid the price for wanting to be more than human. His death marked the end of an era, but also the birth of a new world, a world where East and West consciously touched for the first time, a world where empire ceased to be just territory and became an idea. Alexander left no throne, he left a vision, and that vision, to this day, inspires, haunts, and challenges all those who dare to dream of eternity. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 before Christ did not merely mark the end of an extraordinary man's journey, it also triggered one of the most chaotic and violent periods of antiquity. His vast and unprecedented empire had been built on the military genius and charisma of a single individual, but there was no heir strong enough, nor an administrative structure mature enough to sustain it. Alexander's son with Roxana had not yet been born, and his half-brother, Philip Arrhidaeus, was mentally unfit to govern. With no legitimate successor, the empire was left at the mercy of the ambition of his generals. These men, known as the diadochi, had marched alongside the king for years, accumulating power, glory, and resentment. And now, before them, lay an open map ready to be contested with blood. At first, an appearance of unity was attempted. Perdiccas, appointed as regent of the empire, took on central administration with the mission of governing in the name of the heirs until Alexander IV came of age. The capital would remain in Babylon. But it soon became clear that the generals would not passively accept Perdiccas's authority. Each already controlled crucial regions. Ptolemy held Egypt, Antigonus, Phrygia, and Asia Minor, Lysimachus, Thrace, Seleucus, Babylon and Persia, Cassander, Macedonia, and mainland Greece. All of them wanted more. All considered themselves legitimate successors of Alexander, and all were willing to wage war for it. The wars of the Diadochi stretched over decades. What began as a struggle for imperial control turned into a brutal game of broken alliances, assassinations of royal family members, city destructions, and bloody battles that completely reshaped the known world. Roxana, Alexander's wife, was murdered along with her son, the young Alexander IV, by order of Cassander. The king's direct bloodline was exterminated, so no legitimate heir could threaten the new rulers. Philip Aridaeus, the half-brother, was also eliminated. The empire, once envisioned as a fusion of cultures and peoples, became a battlefield for warlords, hungry for total domination. Ptolemy, more cunning than the others, made a symbolic and strategic move. He seized Alexander's body, which was being transported to Macedonia, and took it to Egypt. There in Alexandria he built a majestic mausoleum to house it. Possession of Alexander's corpse conferred political prestige, as it represented continuity and legitimacy. Thus Egypt became not only a center of power, but a sanctuary of Alexandrian memory. The Ptolemaic dynasty would endure for 3 centuries, culminating in the figure of Cleopatra. Ptolemy's policy was not only one of war. He invested in culture, science, religion, and urban development. Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded, became the new beacon of the world. Meanwhile, Seleucus consolidated control of Asia and Mesopotamia, founding the Seleucid dynasty, which would govern vast regions of the east. His rule was extensive but fragile, constantly threatened by local revolts and the vast distances between provinces. Antigonus, for his part, attempted to reunify the empire under his command, but was ultimately defeated and killed at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 before Christ. With his death, the dream of reunification collapsed completely. The world Alexander had once unified in a single march was now fractured into dozens of independent kingdoms, all echoing his glory, but none wielding his absolute power. The consequences of this collapse were paradoxical. On one hand, the ideal of unity perished. The Hellenistic world would never again be ruled by a single authority. On the other hand, Alexander's cultural legacy spread even more powerfully. The Diadochi Wars gave rise to new cities, promoted religious syncretism, and stimulated trade and science. Amidst the violence, philosophical academies, libraries, and observatories flourished. Hellenism, this fusion of Greek values with Eastern traditions, spread wherever Alexander's armies had once marched. Even the peoples who had fought against him began to claim parts of his myth. The collapse of Alexander's empire was not a failure, but a transformation. He left no successors, but he left seeds. Each Diadochus, in attempting to claim his inheritance, inadvertently spread the king's legacy. The Greek language became the lingua franca throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Philosophical and scientific thought blossomed. The gods took on new names, and temples housed Hellenistic-style sculptures, even in the most distant lands. Alexander had died, but his idea of the world lived on, now through multiple thrones, coins, monuments, and calendars. His empire had fallen, but his immense shadow still covered the world. When Alexander the Great founded Alexandria in 331 before Christ on the shores of the Egyptian Mediterranean, he likely did not realize he was creating not just a city, but an immortal symbol. Although he spent only brief moments in the region, it was he who chose the location, the urban layout, and the ambition for greatness. The city, which would soon become the capital of Egypt under the command of Ptolemy, his general and successor, was designed to be the heart of the Hellenistic world, a metropolis that would merge Greek science, Egyptian religiosity, Phoenician commerce, and Persian organization into a single brilliant civilization. Alexandria was not just a port, it was an idea, a beacon of light in a world marked by war and shadow. Soon after Alexander's death, Ptolemy transformed the city into his capital and invested in it with a vision that went beyond politics. He ordered the construction of palaces, temples, wide avenues, and most importantly, institutions dedicated to knowledge. It was there that the famous Museum of Alexandria arose, a complex that brought together thinkers, artists, astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers from all corners of the known world. Inspired by the concept of a sanctuary of the muses, the museum functioned as a center of continuous research and learning. There lived and worked figures such as Euclid, the father of geometry, Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference with stunning precision, and Hipparchus, who began the cataloguing of stars. Around them, dozens of scholars conducted experiments, wrote treatises, and taught in an environment unlike any other in antiquity. But the supreme jewel of Alexandria was the library, perhaps the most legendary in history. Its goal was bold: to gather all the books of the world in one place. The Ptolemies ordered that every ship docking in the city have its books confiscated, copied, and archived. The originals remained in the library, the copies were returned. Scrolls came from Egypt, India, Persia, Greece, Phoenicia, and Ethiopia. At its height, the Library of Alexandria is estimated to have held between 400,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls. It was not just a repository of knowledge, it was a living organism, an archetype of universal wisdom, a dream of gathering, preserving, and studying everything humanity had ever thought. Alexandria's cultural impact was immense. The city became a reference for other metropolises. Its schools influenced generations of scholars. Its library fueled translations, encyclopedias, and discoveries. It was there that Greek thought engaged with Oriental, Jewish, Egyptian, and Indian traditions, generating new religious and philosophical syntheses. Stoics, Epicureans, skeptics, and Neoplatonists all drank from the Alexandrian fountain. The city was also the birthplace of the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the so-called Septuagint, which enabled the meeting of Judaism and Hellenic philosophy, laying the groundwork for the emergence of Christianity. Culturally, Hellenism reached its peak in Alexandria. The term, derived from Hellenic, or Greek, refers to the fusion between Greek culture and the Eastern traditions absorbed after Alexander's conquests. In the Hellenistic world, sculptures became more expressive. Temples began to house gods with multiple identities, and religious rituals blended languages and symbols. A single citizen might worship Zeus, Isis, and Mithras. There was a spiritual, artistic, and social cosmopolitanism. Coins circulated with effigies of kings wearing Persian crowns and Greek robes. Women who had previously held restricted roles in classical polis began to have more presence in Hellenistic courts. Education, medicine, engineering, and mathematics flourished with uncommon freedom. But Alexandria was also a political city. Its port handled thousands of ships. Merchants from Asia, Africa, and Europe traded fabrics, grains, perfumes, slaves, spices, and papyri. The city became a meeting point for armies, diplomats, artists, and adventurers. It was an organized Babel, an expanded Athens, a Rome before Rome. Its population included Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, Syrians, Phoenicians, Nubians, Persians, and Indians. This diversity, while fertile in culture, also generated constant tensions, revolts, religious disputes, and identity clashes. Yet even in times of crisis, Alexandria remained a symbol of the post-Alexander world, plural, dynamic, intelligent, and restless. The city survived for centuries as one of the most important centers of the ancient world. Even after the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty and Egypt's annexation by Rome, Alexandria continued to influence Western thought. Its libraries and schools operated until the 4th century after Christ, when fires, wars, and religious disputes began the slow process of its destruction. Even so, its name endured, and with it the memory of a unique moment in history, when the world tried to unite around knowledge. When a city at the edge of the desert dared to gather the spirit of all peoples into a single body, Alexandria was the heart of Alexander the Great's legacy, not through swords, but through ideas, and its brilliance, though dimmed by the ashes of time, still echoes in every library of the modern world. After all, Western civilization, as we know it, is in part the child of the light that was born in that coastal city where a king's dreams became eternal pages. After his death, Alexander ceased to be merely a conqueror and became a mythological figure of planetary reach. His name crossed the boundaries of the Hellenistic world and took root in Eastern cultures, where his story was reinterpreted, transformed, and absorbed with deep reverence. In regions as distinct as Persia, Mesopotamia, India, and the Arab Islamic world, Alexander was not remembered solely as a warrior. He came to be seen as a prophet, a just king, a visionary, and even a near-sacred figure. His image was shaped by the fascination he inspired, and by the need to give meaning to his historical presence. The Alexander of Asia was not the same as the one in Greek chronicles. He became a malleable legend, capable of adapting to the spirituality, literature, and imagination of many different peoples. In Persia, where Alexander had destroyed empires, plundered palaces, and overthrown kings, his image was paradoxically preserved with a certain admiration. Though the Persians had suffered the fall of Darius III, they integrated Alexander's name into their literary traditions. In the Shahnameh, the Persian national epic written by Ferdowsi in the 10th century after Christ, Alexander appears as Iskandar, a complex figure, half Persian, half foreigner, sometimes a destroyer, sometimes a bearer of wisdom. He is portrayed as someone destined by the heavens to accomplish great deeds, including dialogues with philosophers and sages of India. Rather than being vilified, he is elevated to the status of a figure of destiny, one whose journey mirrors both the fragility and the glory of empires. This transformation of Alexander reached its peak in the Islamic world. From the 7th century onward, with the expansion of Islam and the translation of Greek and Persian texts into Arabic, Alexander's figure was reinterpreted through the lens of the new faith. Thus emerged Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a character mentioned in the Quran in chapter 18, the Surah of the Cave. Dhul-Qarnayn is described as a powerful and just sovereign who traveled to the ends of the world, established barriers against evil forces, and protected people from the barbaric tribes of Gog and Magog. Many medieval scholars, both Muslim and Christian, directly associated Dhul-Qarnayn with Alexander due to his universal deeds, the symbolic use of two horns, common in Alexandrian coins, and his role as a defender of humanity. Islam, therefore, absorbed Alexander as an instrument of divine will, no longer just a king but a messenger of cosmic order. In Arabic and Persian texts, he is portrayed traveling across the world, meeting prophets, debating with ascetics, seeking the fountain of youth, building magical walls, and even confronting supernatural creatures. This Islamic Alexander is far from the Macedonian warrior of Western historians. He is a synthesis of philosophy, mysticism, and power. Over the centuries, his name was used by sultans and caliphs as a symbol of royal wisdom and universal authority. His image adorned illuminated manuscripts, and his legend was told in madrasas as a moral tale of virtue and leadership. In India, where Alexander stayed only briefly but left a lasting impression, his memory was reimagined by both Hindu and Muslim traditions. Among the Rajas, he was seen as a Chakravartin, the ideal conqueror of the world's wheel. In Sanskrit and Persian medieval texts, there are fantastic accounts of his encounters with yogis and naked ascetics, his entry into enchanted forests, and his dialogues with holy men about the true meaning of existence. In these versions, Alexander does not seek merely lands, he seeks truth. He seeks the infinite. In some narratives, he does not die from illness, but from discovering that there is no glory in conquering the outer world if the inner world remains unknown. In China, although less directly influenced, Alexander's name arrived through indirect reports, especially via the Silk Road and contact with the Islamic world. He appears as an exotic and distant figure, but associated with universal power. In certain Taoist texts, echoes exist of a Western king who sought immortality and found hidden masters in the mountains at the end of the world. Even if not named directly, the archetype of Alexander blends with the image of great imperial wanderers who cross worlds and return transformed. This multiplicity of versions proves that Alexander was more than an individual. He was a mirror in which each civilization saw its own aspirations reflected. In the West, he was the classical hero, supreme strategist, archetype of military genius. In the East, he was the wise king, the seeker of truth, the bridge between worlds. This ability to transcend cultures, languages, and religions turned Alexander into something rare in human history, a globally shared myth, one that belongs not to a single people, but to all. And that is why, more than 2 millennia after his death, his name is still spoken with admiration, awe, and mystery in churches, mosques, palaces, and books. In Antiquity, Alexander was remembered not only as a conqueror or king, he became a philosophical and political paradigm. The magnitude of his deeds and the complexity of his character placed him in a unique position within the imagination of Greco-Roman thinkers. Far beyond military history, Alexander was debated in academies, praised by some as a model of excellence, and criticized by others as an example of hybris, the arrogance of those who defy the gods. His name appeared in philosophical dialogues, political treatises, and historical works as an object of contemplation on power, destiny, virtue, and the limits of human ambition. It was impossible to ignore him, and impossible not to try to understand him. The Stoics, for instance, viewed Alexander with ambivalence. On one hand, they admired his self-discipline and ability to endure hardship. On the other, they criticized his attachment to power and his pursuit of earthly immortality. For Zeno of Citium, founder of Stoicism, virtue lay in indifference to the external and serenity before fate, values difficult to reconcile with a man who sought endless expansion of dominion. Yet Alexander was cited as someone who, had he been more of a philosopher and less of a warrior, might have been the greatest of sages. This contradiction was central. Alexander had all the potential to be the ideal king of philosophy, but he chose the path of conquest. Aristotle, who was Alexander's tutor during his youth, saw in the Macedonian prince the potential to unite thought and action. According to accounts, Aristotle wrote a special version of the Iliad for him with moral commentary, transforming the epic poem into an ethical guide. Alexander carried this copy with him throughout his campaigns. The relationship between them is surrounded by myth, but the fact that one of history's greatest philosophers was the mentor of the greatest conqueror of antiquity did not go unnoticed by later intellectuals. For many, Alexander was the living embodiment of paideia, the integral formation of body, mind, and soul. His mastery of both logos and the sword made him a near-Platonic figure, the philosopher-king in the flesh. Although Plato had died before Alexander's rise, he too was often linked to the conqueror by his followers. Plato's idea of the ideal ruler, just, wise, guided by reason, served as a mold to interpret Alexander's reign. Even if he did not follow Platonic precepts to the letter, his figure was used to illustrate both the potential and the dangers of concentrating so much power in one person. After all, Alexander proved that the rule of a single man could reshape the world, for better or for chaos. Platonic dialogues began to be revisited with Alexander as a living example of what could happen when philosophy meets absolute power. Among ancient historians like Arrian Plutarch, Diodorus of Sicily, and Quintus Curtius Rufus, Alexander was portrayed with a mixture of admiration and unease. Arrian, for example, saw him as a hero comparable to Achilles, guided by an ideal of glory that elevated him above ordinary men. Plutarch, in his parallel lives, painted a more psychological portrait, exploring the king's internal dilemmas and moral contradictions. Diodorus highlighted his reforms and leadership skills, while Curtius emphasized the darker side of his personality, his anger, vanity, and outbursts of cruelty. Yet all of them recognized something extraordinary in Alexander, a man who defied any simple categorization. Politically, Alexander became the symbol of what the ancients called a universal monarchy. He was the archetype of the emperor who transcends ethnic and cultural boundaries to rule as a unifying figure of humanity. His attempt to merge Greeks and Persians, to promote mixed marriages, and to adopt symbols from multiple religions inspired both Roman emperors and Eastern rulers. In the Roman Empire, especially under Augustus, Alexander was seen as the ideal predecessor. Statues of Alexander were widespread, and many generals dreamed of following in his footsteps. Julius Caesar reportedly wept before a statue of Alexander upon realizing that at the same age he had not accomplished half as much. Cynic and Epicurean philosophers also referenced Alexander, but as an example of the futility of power. Diogenes of Sinope, the most famous of the Cynics, supposedly had a legendary encounter with Alexander, during which the king asked what he could offer him. Diogenes replied, "Step aside, you're blocking my sun." Whether real or not, the phrase became a parable about freedom and detachment. Not even the most powerful man in the world could offer anything to a philosopher who was already whole within himself. For the Cynics, Alexander embodied illusion, a man who had everything but lived in restless pursuit, a symbol of the endless quest that never finds rest. Thus, Alexander passed through the centuries of antiquity not only as a historical figure, but as a philosophical enigma, a man who achieved the impossible and yet died young, alone, and inconsolable, a model of greatness and a cautionary tale. He was read, analyzed, and represented through every possible lens: virtue, ambition, wisdom, hybris, fate. His life served as a mirror for thinkers to reflect on what it means to lead, to conquer, to dream, and on what is lost along the way. For in the end, Alexander's image continues to provoke a fundamental question: does the world belong to those who conquer it, or to those who understand it? To the Romans, Alexander the Great was more than a legendary figure of the Greek past. He was an obsession, a model to be equaled, surpassed, or at the very least revered and studied. Throughout the history of the Roman Republic and later the Empire, the figure of Alexander loomed as an unattainable ideal of power, glory, and absolute command. Generals, consuls, and emperors saw in him the archetype of the supreme leader, the man who shaped the world through sword and spirit. And even when they compared themselves to his deeds, the tone was always reverent. Alexander was the measure of all ambition, the mythical standard by which all of Rome judged its place in history. Julius Caesar was the first to make this admiration a public confession. In a famous episode, upon visiting Alexandria, Caesar stood before the statue of Alexander and wept. He was 32 years old, the same age at which Alexander had died, and lamented that despite all his offices and campaigns, he had not yet achieved comparable glory. This moment, recorded by Suetonius and others, was not merely an emotional curiosity, but an expression of a profound feeling that Alexander represented a model too great to be surpassed. For Caesar, who would go on to cross the Rubicon, dismantle the Republic, and establish dictatorship, Alexander was the ultimate justification for total ambition. Other Romans followed that same impulse. Pompey, called Magnus, explicitly sought to present himself as the new Alexander. His youthful fame, Eastern campaigns, and spectacular triumphs in Rome were all built around that comparison. Mark Antony, during his time in Egypt, even dressed as Alexander during public ceremonies to evoke the king's prestige among Hellenized peoples. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, inherited this fascination and visited Alexander's tomb in Alexandria. According to sources, he was permitted to view the embalmed body and placed a golden crown upon it, but refused to visit the tombs of the pharaohs, thus emphasizing his connection to the Macedonian conqueror, not the local kings. Alexander's impact on the Roman imagination was both practical and symbolic. Politically, he was cited as the ultimate example of centralized rule, a man who, with absolute authority, governed a pluralistic empire with a firm hand. For theorists of power, this was valuable. Writers like Livy, Cicero, and Tacitus referenced Alexander to explore the limits of personal authority, the dangers of personality cults, and the role of fate in the lives of great men. In rhetorical schools, his biography served as material for speeches, praising him as a hero or condemning him as a tyrant. The ambiguity was intentional. By studying Alexander, the Romans studied themselves. On the military front, Alexander was a constant reference. His tactics, strategic boldness, ability to adapt to varied terrains, and campaign logistics were all subjects of study. Roman generals mimicked his formations, aimed for the same speed in their marches, and copied his leadership style, close to the soldiers. Even his ability to maintain cohesion among multicultural troops was seen as a lesson for Roman armies, which also relied on legions composed of allies, provincials, and mercenaries. Many Roman officers carried copies of Alexander's campaigns as informal manuals of wartime leadership, but there was also a deeper, more philosophical dimension to this fascination. From the 1st century after Christ onward, the Roman world began to reflect more intensely on the limits of human ambition. Once again, Alexander returned to the center of the discussion. Stoic philosophers like Seneca questioned whether all that conquest had truly brought happiness. Alexander had defeated kings, crossed deserts, founded cities, but died young, exhausted, and without heirs. Was it worth it? The same question was echoed by early Christian writers. Lactantius, for instance, saw Alexander as an example of the futility of earthly power without spiritual wisdom. The Church would later use Alexander as a warning against pride, while emperors continued to invoke him as a symbol of universal authority. The paradox was clear. Alexander was both inspiration and warning. Rome revered him but also feared him. It longed to imitate him, yet dreaded repeating his excesses. This is why his image permeated Roman culture with such force. Alexander appeared on coins, frescoes, busts, and stained glass, not merely as a historical figure, but as a pedagogical instrument. A statue of him was not mere decoration. It was a political lesson, a mirror for those who held power. And Roman emperors, even the greatest among them, knew this. They knew Alexander was still there, silent but present, watching, judging, waiting to see who would dare to be greater than him. During the Middle Ages, Alexander ceased to be merely a historical figure or a political model. He became a legendary, spiritualized, and at times almost prophetic character. His memory crossed the centuries like an invisible thread, connecting the classical world to the new era of Christian kingdoms, Islamic empires, and Jewish traditions. In all these contexts, the image of Alexander was reimagined to serve the religious, moral, and symbolic needs of each period. He was no longer just the Macedonian king who defeated Darius or founded Alexandria. He was the Rex Quondam et Futurus, the king who was and who, in some way, still is. An eternal hero whose deeds became parables, whose journeys turned into spiritual quests, and whose victories merged with the fabric of religious mythologies. In medieval Christian tradition, Alexander appears in apocryphal texts as well as chronicles and sermons. It was not uncommon for monastic scribes to add theological commentary to Alexandrian biographies, interpreting his campaigns as metaphors for the battle against evil or the quest for divine wisdom. In some versions, Alexander travels to the ends of the known world, not merely for conquest, but to find the gates of paradise. The famous legend of the Gates of Alexander, supposedly built by him to lock away the barbarian peoples of Gog and Magog, appears in Christian chronicles as a foreshadowing of the apocalypse. These peoples, according to eschatological imagination, would be unleashed only at the end of times to test the faith of the righteous and announce the final judgment. Thus, Alexander becomes not a worldly warrior, but an instrument of providence. In the Islamic world, as previously discussed, Alexander was associated with the figure of Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran, but in Persian, Arabic, and Turkish literatures, he also became the protagonist of spiritual romances. The Iskandarnamasi, or Book of Alexander, written by Nizami Ganjavi in the 12th century, blends history, theology, philosophy, and poetry. Alexander is portrayed as a philosopher king in search of ultimate knowledge. He faces monsters, consults sages, finds hidden cities, and debates the meaning of existence. In one of the most famous passages, Alexander searches for the fountain of youth, but it is his servant who finds it first, a symbol of the contrast between power and humility. For Sufi mystics, Alexander's journey was an allegory of the human soul's quest for God. In Jewish tradition, Alexander appears in the Khaxis Talmud of Dex with respect and mystery. There are stories in which he visits Jerusalem, meets with elders, and shows reverence for Hebrew laws. In some versions, he even allows the Jews to maintain their faith and practices under his rule. The idea that a Gentile king could respect divine wisdom and Israel's commandments was valued by rabbis, who saw Alexander as a figure of transition between brutal paganism and rational monotheism. In this context, he becomes a bridge between ancient times and the age of revelation. Not a prophet, but someone capable of recognizing the truth even without fully belonging to it. In medieval Europe, especially between the 12th and 14th centuries, the so-called Tipi, Alexander romances, emerged. Epic texts in French, English, German, Castilian, and Italian that recounted the king's adventures with magical, exotic, and often fantastic elements. In these versions, Alexander battles dragons, visits the bottom of the sea in a glass capsule, ascends to the sky in a chariot pulled by griffins, and converses with talking trees. The boundaries between history and fantasy are blurred. What matters in these romances is not accuracy, but moral teaching. Alexander is a noble, curious, generous knight, a forerunner of the Christian chivalric ideal. Even his flaws are treated as warnings, lessons on pride, unchecked ambition, and the inevitable destiny of all men. This fusion of history and myth was reinforced by artistic representations. In Gothic cathedral stained glass, frescoes, tapestries, and sculptures, Alexander appears dressed as a medieval knight, crowned, armored, often bearing a cross on his chest. He is transported into the present of the artists who recreated him. Just like biblical kings and martyr saints, Alexander becomes part of a moral pantheon where courage, wisdom, and divine fear coexist. His image was so popular that many European royal genealogies tried to trace fictional lineage back to him as a way to legitimize their power and divine right to rule. To be descended from Alexander, even fictitiously, was to bear the seal of eternal glory and authority. Therefore, in the Middle Ages, Alexander was much more than a relic of antiquity. He was reinvented as a symbol of wisdom, a just king, a defender of faith, and a seeker of the divine. His deeds were reshaped to inspire pilgrims, teach young princes, and warn rulers. With each passing century, he re-emerged in new garb, at times a crusader, at times an Islamic philosopher, at times the ideal Jewish king. This malleability of his figure, this capacity to adapt to so many cultures and beliefs, is what ensured his survival in the collective imagination. Alexander crossed through time not merely with swords, but with stories. Stories that still invite us today to reflect on power, eternity, and what it truly means to be great. When we speak of Alexander the Great, we do not speak merely of a king or a conqueror. We speak of an idea, a presence that has survived time not because his cities still stand, or because his armies were never defeated, but because his memory crossed civilizations, beliefs, and centuries as a malleable and eternal symbol. Alexander is not just the man who lived between 356 and 323 before Christ. He is, above all, the myth that lives on in every culture that dreamed of absolute power, of the fusion of peoples, and of transcending the human condition through sheer will. He has been seen as an emperor, a saint, a warrior, a sage, a tragic hero, and a seeker of immortality. And it is this plurality that makes him, more than any other figure from antiquity, an immortal archetype. Historically, his trajectory is astonishing in its speed and intensity. In just 13 years of campaigns, Alexander crossed continents, defeated ancient empires, founded over 20 cities, united previously irreconcilable cultures, and redrew the map of the known world. But the chronological facts are only the surface. What makes Alexander eternal is the way each generation has reinterpreted those deeds. To the Greeks, he was the heir of Achilles. To the Egyptians, a reincarnation of Amun. To the Persians, an enlightened conqueror. To the Romans, the model of the ideal emperor. To Christians, a warning against vanity. To Muslims, an agent of divine order. To medieval people, a knight in search of the infinite. This process of mythification is revealing. It means that Alexander was at once deeply human and radically symbolic. Human in his mistakes, his outbursts of rage, his late regrets, and the loneliness of his final years. But symbolic because his existence was used as a mirror for humanity's greatest questions. What is power? What is the value of a grand life? Is there glory without wisdom? Can the world be united? Alexander did not leave answers. He left questions. And those questions are what keep him alive. Every time a thinker, an artist, or a ruler revisits his story, he reappears, not as a static figure, but as a living provocation. By dying so young, Alexander became even more untouchable. He did not grow old, did not fail in old age, did not watch his empire decay slowly. He died at the height of his power, surrounded by unfinished projects, founded cities, and a map of ambitions left unbuilt. That sudden interruption created a narrative void that myth was quick to fill. The fountain of youth he sought, the lost tomb that still intrigues archaeologists, the embalmed body that mysteriously vanished, the Library of Alexandria, whose name echoes his memory. Each of these historical gaps fuels the flame of myth. Where documents are lacking, legend arises. Where there is silence, imagination blossoms. Today, Alexander continues to be studied, adapted, filmed, dramatized. He lives in academic works, but also in historical novels, television series, epic films, and geopolitical debates. Modern leaders cite his military strategies. Psychologists analyze his psyche. Historians compare him to Napoleon, Genghis Khan, Hitler, or Caesar. But none of them is Alexander. None of them combined in so short a time such a fusion of strength, vision, charisma, and boundless ambition. Alexander the Eternal transcends comparisons. He is the measure against which all others are judged. And perhaps this is the final point, or rather the ellipsis, of Alexander's story. He will never fully belong to any one era, religion, or ideology. He is the man who walked among legends, who founded cities in deserts, who slept under foreign stars, and who died surrounded by silence and rumor. A king with no true heirs, a god with no single temple, an idea in perpetual motion. Alexander remains alive every time someone asks how far the human will can go, every time someone looks at a map and dreams of more than borders, every time an ancient name is whispered in the shadows of history, not as memory, but as possibility.